friends, this is Trish, and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Dr. James Lindsay from New Discourses, and he has written a fascinating book called The Marxification of Education, and that will be our topic today. And there is so much to talk about that I am just going to go ahead and dive right in. So, James, what I would like to ask you is, first of all, about Karl Marx. Most people think of him only in terms of communism or socialism. And whenever people bring up Marx in education, they kind of think, oh, that's ridiculous. It's totally different. So how would you start to explain to people how Marxism got so incorporated into education?
I mean, to really tell this story takes like an hour, 2 hours. It's really, it is kind of a whole dimension of the story of the 20th century. There's a lot to that, obviously, and we've got a quarter of a century since. But kind of the long and short of it is, if you understand what communists or Marxists believe about their own ideas, is that they believe that their ideas have to be kind of everywhere. But more importantly, they think that the dominant model by which people learn or come to understand themselves in society and grow into society is something called socialization. So they have this hypothesis that society in its total organization socializes people to be certain ways. And so education is obviously a major part of that for children who are growing up to become adults. So the way that they view education, not completely wrongly in the superficial level, is that they see education as working to produce a next generation who will be able to integrate successfully into and advance the economy. Now, that part of the analysis is not wrong. Education is designed in part to produce functional, employable adults who are going to integrate into society and the economy and to advance it. But the thing is that they also believe that the existing social, political, and economic system are fundamentally illegitimate, that they are predicated off of this concept called class warfare or class conflict or class struggle. And that what happens is that if we educate our children without Marxist theory being part of what they're learning, they will not learn to see the class struggle and then resist it. Instead, they'll learn to reproduce it. So we're teaching children to believe that it is their role to get into the society and to reproduce the existing society the way that it is and economy the way that it is. But they think that's bad. They actually call this the problem of reproduction. And so for the first 2/3 or so of the 20th century, starting really, I would say, it's not totally fair to say that. It was starting maybe around the mid 1910s, early 1920s. You start to see real socialist activity kind of picking up. You start to see the formation of the Communist Party USA, which was established in Minnesota, which kind of answers a couple of questions tangential to our purposes here. You start to see the Soviet Union incorporates in 1917 as well. You start to see this kind of push. You have people like John Dewey and the social reformers in education kind of picking up with a lot of those ideas and thinking that they're great, Lev Vygotsky and so on. But they never figure out how to solve the problem of reproduction until we get about to the 1970s. Late 1970s, you have people that are really wrestling with Michael Apple and so on, who are really wrestling with the problem of reproduction. They're trying to figure out how to get Marxism into the education system in order to disrupt the cycle of societal reproduction. The problem, again, very simply, is that schools teach kids to be members of the society that they're in, thus reproducing the society from one generation to the next. And they don't want the society to reproduce itself because it's oppressive. They want a new society. So you have to figure out how to hijack that. And so what happens is in the 1980s, you have the injection into the United States, slowly at first, of a model that gets called critical pedagogy. And critical pedagogy is derived from this Brazilian thinker who is the subject of my book, Marxification of Education, whose name is Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian. He was a Marxist. He had studied under the so-called Red Bishop of Recife, Brazil, which is where he was from. He had been radicalized with Dom Elder Camaro, the Red Bishop, by looking at the favelas, the slums of Recife, and understanding, in his opinion, that there was a massive injustice happening in the political economy of Brazil. This he saw as partly due to colonization. He saw it as partly due to capitalism, but he adopted this kind of new model of communist thought about, or Marxist thought about how society was organized. And he developed in Brazil in the early 1960s a method of literacy training that took over for a while until they ended up getting in 1967 or 8, they got a conservative, or really not even a conservative, a right-wing dictator as government. And that guy kicked Freire out of Brazil, chased him out. He went to Bolivia. He got chased out of Bolivia. He went to Chile. And in Chile, he studied with some Marxist priests and came back a fully fledged Marxist. But anyway, his model was that in order to get peasants and people who live in the slums interested in wanting to study, say, reading or math or whatever practical thing, you had to also get them to understand why it was relevant for them to learn. They were so alienated from the learning process that they didn't want to learn. Why should I bother to read? I'm just a peasant. Why should I bother to study mathematics? I live in the slum, right? And so to overcome that, and I'm giving a very charitable interpretation of what he was doing, but to overcome that, he thought that if he made the education system more, or the education program more relevant to their lives, that they would be more engaged and more willing to learn. So he comes up with this literacy training method that begins with political literacy. He calls it this model of generative themes. The idea is that you talk to the students, you decide what's relevant in their lives, then you form a lesson around what's going on in their lives, where you start by talking about the political relevance, and then you inject into that the once they're now interested in the subject because you've talked about the political relevance, you've given them political literacy of their circumstances, he called it, then they're going to be motivated to want to have actual literacy in order to understand their circumstance more deeply and challenge it. And he says explicitly his magnum opus is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He published it in English before he published it in his native Portuguese. It was published in 1970 in English. And he, in the first chapter, I think there's 4 chapters. I haven't read it in a little while. I'd have to look back, but I think there's 4 chapters. In one of the footnotes, footnote number 10, I've had to cite it a few times, of the first chapter, he explains that he derived this methodology by examining what was working in Mao's Cultural Revolution in China. And specifically, the model he was using, although he doesn't say so, is the mass line model, which is where Mao Zedong would poll the masses or study the masses to find out what they were agitated about, wrap it up in a communist package to advance one of his own party agendas, and then feed it back as a propaganda push so that the thing people actually already cared about would be the thing that was told to them in communist terms to advance Mao's agenda, and he would activate them through their own values. And this is what the generative model is about. You ask the students what they're interested in, what's concerning in their lives, and he specifically said a generative theme should be emotionally resonant. It should be relevant to the real concerns of their existence on a day-to-day basis, what we call lived experience today. And then you're going to package it up in a way that politically explains through a Marxist lens what's going on, and then you feed it back as a literacy lesson. So this model started to get picked up in the 80s in the United States, mostly by a guy named Henry Giroux, who was a card-carrying communist, who was enraptured with this particular method of teaching. He saw this as the opportunity he'd been looking for, to have a language, to have a model he could bring to his schools, which were by and large conservative, even in Rhode Island where he was teaching, and that he would be able to, inject this method with as it was, but also addressing what he called at the time the European theorists, who would include the critical theorists that Giroux had been studying, Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, and so on, but also the European postmodern theorists, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida in particular, were of interest to Giroux. So he brings this method in, calls it critical pedagogy, critical being critical theory, the point of it being to raise a critical consciousness, to, as Paulo Freire had it, to conscientize the students to their political circumstances in the guise of doing an academic lesson. So you do the political lesson as the excuse, or to bring about the academic lesson. But what happens in practice is that you use the math lesson, reading lesson, subject matter lesson as an excuse to have a political conversation with students on politicized terms. But this gives you the opportunity to bring a Marxist analysis in a highly personalized, highly emotional, Maoist actually way to students in a way that's hidden enough to where it can pass curriculum, it can pass administration. It can get under the radar of parents. And so this was the method that they derived to bypass the problem of reproduction. And just as kind of one final point, and to put a bow on this, a lot of people today in education have heard the term and know the term and have to work with the term culturally relevant teaching or culturally relevant pedagogy, which was developed in the 90s. 1995 is when the first paper comes out about it by Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's still working in education to this day. And Gloria Ladson-Billings explains, if you actually read what she wrote in those papers, she doesn't just explain Freire's model, but she says that she got it from Paulo Freire. And so she's taken this generative model and repackaged it. But look at what Freire was doing in the first place, or look at what Mao was doing with the mass line in the first place, which is that they're asking the students or asking the masses what's agitating you, what's relevant to your life, and then packaging it up with a Marxist interpretation and then pushing it back on them. That's exactly what culturally relevant teaching is. How do we get, say, an ethnic group or a group of students or whatever who have, maybe it's poverty, maybe it's, again, ethnicity, maybe it's sexuality or whatever, and how do we find out what their concerns are, package them up through a woke lens, kind of neo-Marxist lens, and then make the education be around that so that it's relevant to them, so that they'll want to learn more. And this is what Gloria Ladson-Billings packaged up. So culturally relevant teaching is just another modernized word for critical pedagogy in essence or in practice, which is what Paulo Freire called education for liberation, which is explicitly a late 20th century, liberationism is a late 20th century Marxist program that fused together the idea of cultural liberation, liberation from colonization or the colonial state, and also the older school Marxist liberation from capitalism. So you have, this is how our education became Marxist. And it started with Paulo Freire and his literally Marxist theory of knowing. There are knowers, and there are people who are said not to be allowed to know, who are wholly ignorant and therefore not full participants in society. So rather than a Marxist theory of money, he created a Marxist theory of knowledge and knowing, and used that to create a educational program that sneaks radicalizing conversations, conscientizing is his word, conscientização in Portuguese or something like that. He sneaks these in to regular academic lessons like literacy or math or social studies or science in order to bring consciousness to the students. Very long answer, but that's the story.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can translate that. So we have Karl Marx, and he focuses on the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that kind of gets translated loosely to oppressed versus oppressor. And then people take that on and they just apply it to their different context. So with Paulo Freire, he had the Brazilian context with the injustice in that situation and the class differences. So he adopts that. And he has the idea that if there's these students that are illiterate, they're not just going to care about phonics. I need to kind of bring the class struggle into the vocabulary so that they're interested in learning. And then other people pick that up and just say, if we want to be able to teach students, we're not just going to teach them maybe reading, writing, arithmetic. We're going to give them the framework of this oppressor versus oppressed dynamic that can apply to any struggle they might be having. And then the purpose of that is to make sure that they're not reproducing society as it is. So they're trying to figure out what's wrong with society, where am I being offended, where am I being oppressed, so that I can presumably break that system and rebel against it. Is that kind of it?
Yeah, the only color I really would add to that is that Marx taking the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, it didn't loosely map onto oppressor versus oppressed. If you read the opening paragraph of the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, there's a preface before that. So there's like a couple paragraphs before. But if you get to chapter 1, first paragraph, the first thing he says is that the history of mankind is the history of class struggles. And then he gives a big list, bourgeoisie versus proletariat. He doesn't actually list, but he talks about patrician and plebeian, guildmaster and laborer or whatever. And then he says, in a word, oppressor versus oppressed. So it's not a loose connection. So Karl Marx explicitly says that the intrinsic conflict is oppressor versus oppressed. That's the model. And he says that, in fact, is the model by which all of human history has evolved. All of human history is oppressor versus oppressed in conflict. And he says that this is a fight that sometimes it's visible, sometimes it's not visible, but that it always ends in one of two ways, which is the revolutionary reconstitution of the society at large, or with the common ruin of the contending classes. So either there's going to be a revolution and a completely new way of thinking, or they're going to destroy everything. Those are the only two options that he gives. This is how he says it always goes. This is the nature of human history. This is what it is that it's just the fight between oppressor and oppressed that's intrinsic to what it means to be human. So yeah, this can then take on a constellation of views. He put it in economics, bourgeoisie versus proletariat. The critical race theorists later reinvent this and put it in terms of race. No. In America, it's not so much that. That's part of it, but the real story is black versus white, or racial minority person of color versus white, and whiteness becomes the ruling ideology instead of capitalism. Obviously, within the realm of queer theory and the sexuality studies, you end up with normal versus queer as the same dividing line. That's oppressor versus oppressed. Some people declare themselves normal, and they oppress people who are deviant to that, and therefore they took on as a power word for themselves the Q word, queer. And you could do this for anything. Marxist feminists do it in terms of the patriarchy and it's males oppressing females. Then Paulo Freire, just again, one little bit of color to your very good summary. Paulo Freire saw it as knowers versus people who are ignorant. So he created the same oppressor versus oppressed dynamic there. And then what, like you said, what they figured out, what Freire actually opened the door to, using Mao as his model. That's literally Mao Zedong, the communist dictator of China, as his model. What he figured out was that you can't do this a big universal program like bourgeoisie versus proletariat. You can't just go around and tell everybody like, oh, all the rich people are bad and you're good. It's class struggle is personal to you and your circumstances. So then it becomes personal. So now if you have a student who is of a minority race, you can use the race tools. If you have a student who is or even of a majority race, because you can induce, guilt and shame and the what they call good white people cycle in them. You can do it with sexuality. You can do it with whatever is in their lives, religious status, immigration status, anything that's relevant to their lives. And this is the innovation is that Paulo Freire brings to the table, that then meshed with this kind of constellation of identity politics versions of Marxism that were developing in the critical theory schools in the American context in the 70s, 60s and 70s. And what he brought was that actually struggle is personal. Struggle is local to you and your group, even if you're the only person in your group. And so all of a sudden you get kind of the whole basis for how you turn intersectionality into a kind of Maoist program to revamp society along different axes of either, oppressed versus oppressor. So yes, it was a great summary. There's just a little more color there. It's actually more frighteningly specific, actually, is what the color is.
All right. So Marx gets to keep oppressor versus oppressed because he's the one that came up with it. The spinoff is more just shading in the varieties of how you can be oppressed. And so I think a lot of people would ask, well, what's wrong with seeing the world that way? Why shouldn't we encourage students to name their oppression so that they can overthrow it?
Well, it's probably not the greatest thing. First of all, what's wrong with it is not true. We're not intrinsically, like, history isn't the progression of one giant war, in different locations. That's just not what's actually happening here. It is not actually true that there is intrinsically class warfare defining everything. But what's actually wrong with it is a style of thinking that comes along with believing you're intrinsically in a class warfare. And again, I'm using the word class here, but class can mean any group, right? So it can be wealthy versus poor. So it could be, bourgeoisie and proletariat, which is owners versus workers. It could be black and white. It could be straight, gay and straight. It could be male and female. Like, it doesn't matter how that line, it's called a line of stratification. It doesn't matter how it's drawn. It could be knowers versus those who are ignorant. It doesn't matter where it is. The point is that when you believe that's an intrinsic conflict, you believe that the people on both sides of that conflict are combatants, and therefore your team needs to have solidarity and all work together against their team, which already has solidarity and is working together, even if they don't know it, against you. Okay, so what that breeds is something called the friend-enemy distinction in politics. Now, that word, that term for it was not created by communists, it was created by a Nazi, Carl Schmitt. And so Carl Schmitt lays out this concept. He says it's the concept of the political. He writes a book about it in 1932, right before he becomes a Nazi. He lays out this idea that politics is essentially, at its very core, it is the battle of friend versus enemy. So what that means, first of all, he describes enemy. Let me color that a little bit in. Enemy for him means public enemy. It doesn't mean personal enemy. It doesn't mean the guy down the street that you just don't like, who's your personal enemy. You know, if you're Jerry Seinfeld, you're Newman, right? He's not your personal enemy. This is a group enemy, a class enemy. This is a political faction that wishes to overrun your way of life. And he sees it in existential terms, like they will crush and destroy you and your way of life if you allow them. So it's public enemy. So friend is also not personal friend. It's not like your best buddy down from the gym or whatever. That's not what he means by friend. The word that he uses the German word for friend, but in his writing, but the word he means is ally. So the kind of very easy way to see it is, when you get these kind of really hardened trans activists, they see the world in terms of two kinds of people. There's trans allies and there's transphobic bigots, friends and enemies. But trans allies, they're not all trans, they're not all whatever. They are everybody who supports their political program. Mao used this same delineation. He called it the people and the enemies of the people. He didn't use the word friends. He said there are the people who are basically on the program of building socialism, and they're the enemies of the people who would hinder it, and they have to be treated as enemies. So this is the intrinsic poison here of Marx's oppressor versus oppressed. The question isn't, is there real oppression that should be resisted sometimes? The answer is certainly there is. It's believing that it's intrinsic to what it means to exist, that there is a oppression and that it is a totalizing conflict, a war of friend versus enemy. And so when you start thinking in lines of friend versus enemy, first of all, you're thinking in terms of conflict. You're never working with the other people unless you're somehow a sellout. So if it's like critical race theory, you can't have a black person who agrees with some article of whiteness without being an Uncle Tom, as it goes, or a race traitor. You can't have a woman who agrees with some points that men are making without being a traitor to her sex. You can't have a worker who sides with the bourgeoisie on certain issues or tries to work with them or tries to make compromises or, like a 40-hour work week during the labor movement without being some kind of a sellout or a capitalist rotor, as they were called under Mao. So everybody on your team now is on your team and gets policed as to be on your team and gets radicalized against the other side. There can be no collaboration across this line anymore because it's a war. And anybody who collaborates is a sellout. This creates a very dangerous, ugly purge culture on your side. You're always looking for class enemies, for class traitors that are embedded within your side, people who have the wrong mentality. So it gets totalitarian and it gets ideologically conformist. And then kind of worst of all is that you'll learn to start to excuse the bad actions of your friends, and you will even paint the good actions of your enemies as bad. So it becomes like the other side can do no right and your side can do no wrong. And this is, this is American politics now. And the reason is because we've now been steeped in 50 years of the friend-enemy distinction. We don't see each other as Americans anymore. We see each other either as Republicans and Democrats or black and white or this religion and that. And we're all fighting with each other because we've adopted that poisonous framing. So what's wrong with it isn't a question of whether or not oppression exists in the world, whether or not it's relevant to your experience or whatever. It's not good, by the way. It's not psychologically healthy to believe that you're intrinsically oppressed. So there are psychological reasons too that externalizes your locus of control. You think that, you're powerless, your life is miserable, rather than somebody who can take action. But look what happens on that model of thinking. If you decide to go, work hard, make yourself better, now you're selling out. You've sold out your class and you've become a class enemy, and they're going to kick you out. You're going to lose all your friends. You're going to be put on the enemy list. You're going to get attacked. The whole thing is just a tremendous slow drip of poison into the minds of people, but especially children. Why would we want to raise our children to believe that society is intrinsically a conflict-oriented project rather than one with some stratifications in society, some of which are more fair than others, and that ultimately we're all sort of playing our part in a giant collaboration called society that sometimes has got some genuine unfairness built in that we should look for and try to address. Seems like that's a much better way than teaching them that society is composed intrinsically of a class conflict of friends versus enemies, and all the friends therefore have to behave in a certain way and will excuse all their wrongdoing because it's for the cause. And the enemy, no matter what they did it wrong. They're doing the wrong thing. There must have been some bad motive that they had for doing it.
I have definitely seen that in a lot of the professional development meetings surrounding race. We had an activity where we had to sit at desks and write down what is whiteness. And then later the conversation was, how do we eliminate whiteness from the institution of education? And now that I'm in a counseling training program, it's been explicitly stated that color blindness is the enemy, that is actually adjacent to oppression. And so it's this really almost cartoonish way of seeing the world where whiteness is bad and blackness is good. And so just like you said, even if somebody white is, being an abolitionist and doing all of this work, some of these like deep critical theories will say, well, they were actually only doing that because it benefited them. They don't really care about the black people. They're just doing it to be politically expedient. And so it's just so true that some of these really, really deep critical theories will literally say that with whiteness, it's almost like they're saying that there is no good and no redemption. At best, you just sacrifice your life to try to put forward the black cause. But even then, you can't really be, cheerleaded at all because the motives are off. Have you kind of seen a lot of that as you've looked into this?
I mean, yeah, it's first of all, I mean, you can look almost anywhere, but the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which was, of course, a multi-million copy bestseller, which as an author who does have a kind of runaway best-selling book, that's an insane number of books to sell. I mean, it's a lot of books to sell. So, she becomes like basically a household name or close to it, certainly in professional circles for a few years, 2018 to maybe 2022, till people figured out that she's white and making a lot of money off of race hustling, and they basically bombed her career. But at any rate, that book is that. I mean, I don't know how many people have actually read it. I know a lot of people got told they had to read it. I don't know how many people bothered. But like chapter 11 of that book is called White Women's Tears, and it talks about how white women, when you accuse them of being a racist, they usually start crying, and what they're doing is that they're not feeling bad. They're actually, weaponizing their tears to regain sympathy and to gain political standing, that's a psychotic thing to write, by the way. And then there's an entire book roughly the same time period, mid 2010s, late 2010s, called Good White People by Shannon Sullivan. The whole point of that book is to explain that white people, the good white liberals specifically, only adopt anti-racism in order to shield themselves from accusations of racism and to feel better for themselves. So it's very common. You also have a book from 2010 that I thought was like really eye-opening. It's called Being White, Being Good. No, Being Good, Being White by Barbara Applebaum, which is specifically an education book, by the way. And it's the same exact thing. And it explains at pretty much great length and deep philosophical, hard philosophical terms why white people can actually, no matter what they do, can never get away from their whiteness because they're intrinsically co-constituted in the system and society that we have. So until there's a full revolution, white people can never get away from it. So they all have this kind of perpetual need to, like you said, sacrifice themselves for the activism, which Robin DiAngelo said is a lifelong commitment to a praxis of what did she say? Self-reflection, self-critique, and so self-reflection, self-criticism, and social activism, which is literally, I mean, that's self-criticism was literally what the Maoists called what they were getting people to do, but in Chinese. And then that's kind of scholarly sources, but I was just looking through yesterday some of the materials that are being put out in Minnesota about the issue about ICE, right? So we've got this huge fight going on in Minnesota right now over ICE and its legitimacy. And what part of that story is that on the left, you have a lot of people who've put out, basically literally training for how to resist ICE. They give out, there's flyers, there's documentation. It's not just like you have to go train with some guy in the back of a bookstore or whatever. There's actually like documents. And they talk about on these documents how it is white women and white mothers in particular, because they are because they're very sympathetic targets. If an ICE agent hits a mother or arrests a mother it's going to play real bad in the media for ICE, right? And so they have an obligation, it says, to go use their privilege to put their bodies on the line. And there's instances that, you know, they're obviously with ICE, that their immigrant neighbors cannot go fight this fight for themselves because they'll get arrested and deported. But also, quote unquote, as gross as the language is, black and brown bodies can't put themselves on the line because they don't have the standing. And obviously the insinuation is that law enforcement in this country doesn't care about racial minorities or immigrants, and therefore they can't get in the fight. So now it's these white women who are, you know, sympathetic characters who are to go put their physical safety on the line, and they're bringing their babies. So this is a, you know, and you're seeing the narratives running all over that this is a prelude to ICE justifying attacking infants. And it's like, holy crap, this has gone like fully crazy. What is happening? But it's all consistent with this literature. And it's exactly what you just said in the trainings that you've been going through, which is that they've adopted this mindset. And once you adopt this mindset, you start thinking in these ways. And there's absolutely nothing you can do that's right if you're in one of these so-called privileged groups. So you have to just keep doing more and more and more, to the point where finally they create justifications for literally crazy behavior, which is to bring your baby, if you're a mother, directly into harm's way as a means of social activism on behalf of whichever cause that happens to be. And that you can, bringing a baby to a dangerous situation is a crazy thing to do, regardless of what you think you're protecting or not protecting, because you're not protecting your own baby. You're putting your baby in harm's way. So this is everywhere. This mentality has gone everywhere. And I think a large part of that is because that mentality through critical pedagogy has been brought mainstream into the methodologies of teaching. That poison gets dripped, that oppressor versus oppressed intrinsic conflict gets dripped into the students' heads, and they start to see the world this way. And incidentally, by the way, the right-wing students are being exposed to the same mentality also, and a lot of them are breaking the other way, right? So they're like, oh, everything really is about race. I have a race. My race is white. It's better. And they decide to play the game on the other side because they still see that there's an intrinsic conflict of maybe it's white versus black, maybe it's, you know, oppressor versus oppressed. And they're like, I'm an oppressor. Okay, I'll oppress. Let's do it. Let's go. And the mindset underneath of that, the friend enemy distinction, can cut the other direction too. And they can form their own enclave, their own ally solidarity group, where they excuse their own bad behavior or encourage it. And so what you get out of this is the logic, not of politics, but of war. And it's everywhere. And like I said, the Maoists use this very specifically. The program was called ideological remolding. I forgot how to say it in Chinese. I learned it at one point, but it was called ideological remolding. And Mao said specifically, at least in 1957, but I'm assuming a lot of other times as well, he said explicitly that it is necessary for people to continue their ideological remolding and to continue doing it, not until it's done, but forever. So just like Robin DiAngelo says, the work is never done. The work is never done. So you got another training you're going to have to go to at work. You're going to have another, you know, continuing education program for your teacher licensure or your whatever, your counseling licensure, your psychology licensure. Even medical licensure is requiring people to take these things now, for, you know, GPs and stuff that has like kind of no real social. I mean, I don't know how many doctors you've seen, but most of them are pretty antisocial to begin with. They're not there to hang out, and so they've triple booked themselves and they're not hanging out. It's like they're not exactly. It's not a profession famous anymore for its you know, social interaction dynamic. But even they're being required to bring this into their logic.
So it really sounds like this has really taken over in colleges and institutions. And there's a theory that the Frankfurt School wanted to do this on purpose. And, you know, I have the names written down. We've got like Herbert Marcuse, Antonio Gramsci. Can you kind of tell us about the players, their philosophies, and what they really wanted to do by capturing the institutions?
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of people get like kind of twisted up about whether or not the Long March through the institutions, as it gets called, was real. I can assure you that it was real, and it was definitely called for by members of the Frankfurt School, namely Herbert Marcuse. You can go get a copy. A lot of people won't believe me, but they can go get a copy of Counter-Revolution and Revolt, which he wrote in 1972. They can get it for themselves. They can look up the phrase, just get a PDF of it. They're available for free online. Just go get one, type it into your search bar, go get a PDF, and then look up the phrase, Long March Through the Institutions, the whole phrase. It'll come up. He talks about it. He says, this is the plan. It was named by a guy in 66 named Rudi Deutschke, who was a communist who was not part of the Frankfurt School. And what it was Rudi Deutschke had looked backwards to the theories of Antonio Gramsci, mostly from the 1910s and early 1920s, because he went to prison after that. But in prison, he wrote these things called the prison notebooks. It's likely that the prison notebooks did not influence Deutschke directly, because they were smuggled out of the prison when Gramsci died in 1937, taken to Moscow, and basically put in a vault until 1970. So Deutschke's talking in 66. He probably isn't using the prison notebooks. He's probably using Gramsci's earlier ideas of cultural infiltration. Gramsci's view was that culture is going to sound like the problem of reproduction all over again. Culture is the ultimate thing that's keeping Europe, in his view, from going communist. And you have to realize when he's writing is during World War I. So what you've had through the early part of the 1900s is a whole bunch of people, the socialist movements building, the workers' parties in Germany, in France, in Italy, especially for Gramsci in Italy, in Europe, the UK, they're all building. And the idea was, of course, supposed to be workers of the world unite, which, by the way, is the last sentence of the Communist Manifesto. So straight from Karl Marx, the goal was that these workers' parties were supposed to see worker solidarity that was international in content. So then World War I rolls around, and World War I has, the Axis versus the Allies. And what happened was, all of a sudden, all the workers' parties forgot that they were supposed to have international solidarity, all of them. And all the Italian workers were Italians, and all the German workers were Germans, and all the British workers were British, and all the French workers were French. And they all literally abandoned their international worker mentality for a nationalistic concept. And so he was freaking out, like, what the heck? What? This isn't going to work. And then he said, here's what's wrong, is that there's a culture. It's not just that capitalism is an economic system, it produces a culture. And that culture pervades all of society. It produces something called cultural hegemony. That's basically the way everybody thinks, kind of construed as a force that keeps, from one generation to the next, keep society thinking the same way. And so what he said is, what we have to actually do if we want to create fertile ground in Europe for socialism is we can't rely on this internationalist stuff. The Soviet Union had barely incorporated by this point, and I don't think any of the countries that became Soviet satellites wanted to be conquered to become communist. I don't think that's what Gramsci would have looked forward to. He argued, I mean, there are letters with him arguing with Lenin about these strategies. So it doesn't seem that's what he wanted. He wanted Europe to go communist because they wanted to go communist. And they did not want to go communist. And he said that the reason was that there was too much culture of capitalism there already. There was no culture of capitalism, by the way, in Russia. They had a peasant society. And that's actually how the Bolsheviks were able to appeal to a large segment of the population. Peace, land, bread. Who wants land and bread? Peasants. Not people who have successful capitalist, jobs, even in bad working conditions. Peace, land, bread was the sales pitch that the Bolsheviks used and won over peasants. So you have this capitalist thing, and he said, well, there's a culture, and there are institutions within any system that reproduce that culture. And it could be the church, and he named the church. He says it's the family. So it's religion, it's family. He says it's education. The education system is designed to reproduce a society. It's media, and it's law. Those are the 5 domains he said. And he said, in order to transform Europe to a situation where it will be willing to go over to socialism or to communism, that we have to get inside these cultural institutions and change their internal culture. He said we have to find what he called organic intellectuals and send them into the institutions and have them inside those, or have them be inside institutions. So you have somebody who's working in whatever domain, law, and you bring him over to socialism, and it's his job to start bringing socialism to law and changing the internal culture of the culture producing institution, so that when the law institutions begin to favor socialism, they'll change the fabric of society. And 2-3 generations down the road, you'll have all of the major culture producing institutions in society, religion, family, education, media, and law, priming the society and the next generation to want to be socialists. So then they'll be ripe to change. So it's this new model where he was seeing that the kind of evangelized to the workers model of communism up to that point wasn't going to work in Europe. This is what I think Deutschke was looking back to. But what had happened was in the late 60s, there was an attempt by the Frankfurt School guys and their students, which they had millions online with them, to have a big revolt. I mean, you've probably heard of the riots in France and Paris in 1968, the May riots in 68, but you also had these throughout 60, a little bit in 67, but a lot in 68 and 69 in the US. And it was all these leftists uprising. A lot of it had to do with, resistance against an anti-war resistance against Vietnam War. And they were having this huge push. And there were, like I said, there were riots all over. Detroit hasn't recovered from the riots of 69 yet. And it may not ever. You talk about this thriving. If you go back and look at some old stuff from Detroit, like Detroit was happening. It's a beautiful city if you go even to this day. And they just hollowed it out because it got so bad there. Then blamed it on white flight. It was just people fleeing, mass violence and whatever. But at any rate, this fails. Marcuse is mad. He writes Essay on Liberation in 1969, like pushing for all of this revolutionary action that's supposed to be happening all around him right now. We're going to get our, switch to socialism here in the United States. And it doesn't work. And so in 1972, he's pissed off. He writes this book called Counter-Revolution and Revolt. And he says, we can't keep doing the street activism. We have to go into the institutions. We have to do what Rudi Deutschke called the long march to the institutions. What that means is if you're a computer programmer, you go be a computer programmer. You're not going to stand out in the street like a bum anymore and yell with a sign. You're going to get a job. You're going to go into the job and you're going to bring your ideology with you. And he says, the most important thing we're going to infiltrate is, and I quote, he says, education at all levels. Because he understands that all of the professional institutions are downstream from education. It doesn't matter. Even churches, the people go to seminaries and go to schools of theology in order to get geared up to be professionals in that field. So education at all levels, he says we have to infiltrate. And like I said, it took them a decade to figure out how. Then there's one other piece of the story politically that a lot of people, it's very pertinent to our moment right now, and people are not paying attention to it, which is that in 1980, Ronald Reagan got elected president. And so now you have this arch conservative. He's going to put America back on track, slashes the tax rates in half, literally. I mean, this is big scale changes, huge difference. He's not putting up with this New Deal era soft socialism program that we've been running since the 30s up to 1980. He completely revamps the shape of the American program. And these, you can go read their writings from 80, 81, 82. They're freaking out. The left is freaking out about Reagan. And they're like, what do we do? And they're like, we go into the institutions. We go into education. And particularly, we start building out departments in universities. They obviously started going into media. They started taking advantage of a lot of the broadcasting to start putting in, more inclusive programming and all of this, very culturally Marxist, Frankfurt School, identity politics sort of stuff, which was high fashion among them. The Combahee River Collective had hit its high mark in 77. So this is kind of the birth of intersectionality as a concept. It doesn't get named until 89, but in 77, the ideas laid out. This is the high fashion and leftist thinking, and it just kind of starts to mainstream everywhere except the halls of power through the 80s, going in through about 95. Then they start under Clinton, start getting positions where they have some power, administrative positions in the education apparatus, for example, Department of Education. So the Long March to the Institutions was largely, it was something that Gramsci believed needed to happen. Nobody knew how to do it. It never worked really in Europe. But then, so the concept there, by the way, the phrase is boring from within. The communists can either try to have a revolution from without, or they can bore from within, like a borehole, like dig a hole in and get inside. So it's an infiltration model. But Rudi Deutschke comes up with this model called the Long March to the Institutions. Herbert Marcuse, after the failed revolutions of the late 60s, calls explicitly for this new strategy. And again, he had millions of hard acolytes at this point. They're using Maoist Cultural Revolution technology. That's, again, explicit. In 69, Marcuse gives an interview with a Frenchman, Pierre Vichon or something like this, and says explicitly, he opens up, right? He says, everybody, the interviewer says, everybody's asking, or everybody's chanting, Marx, Mao, Marcuse, Marx, Mao, Marcuse, the three M's. What do you think of this? And he says, just straight out, he says, well, obviously, everybody today who's not a communist of strict obedience, every Marxist, he says today, who's not a communist of strict obedience is a Maoist. So they bring the Maoist cultural model, which you call it DEI meetings. Mao called it Su Ku, which means speak bitterness meetings. They would get people together and have them vent their bitterness at each other. Confess to your racism. They would have people confess until they recognize their crimes from the people's standpoint, Pipang Dojang or something like that. I think that's critical struggle is what that means. And so they imported these methodologies and brought them in. But by the early 70s, it was like, look, we can't keep fighting in the streets. It's not going to work. We're going to take this kind of academic frisson that we have under the Frankfurt School guys, who are all embedded in elite universities at that point, and we're going to bore from within. We're going to go into the professions and change them from the inside out along the lines of what Gramsci had written. And again, it's explicit. It's right there in black and white in his book. This is our new plan. He had enough acolytes to where I believe that would have been effectual. There was, of course, a fight between the so-called new left and the old left being the old Marxists. They got kicked out of the scene. The new left took over. The Vietnam War was one of the primary reasons they were able to do that environment. These are like all your hippie boomers who ended up going in and getting PhDs, and a lot of them became professors, and they took over all those liberal colleges in Massachusetts and California and so on first, and then basically everywhere else. And then through the 80s, it was a deliberate move to counter the fact of political power in the Reagan White House. So, yeah, it happened. I mean, you can very easily document following their own writing that they said they were going to do it. This is what the model's based off. This is how it's going to be done. And here's how we're doing it. I mentioned Henry Giroux, one last point earlier, right? So Henry Giroux is the guy who names critical pedagogy. He brings Paulo Freire's ideas and Paulo Freire himself to the United States very kind of independently. Well, he finds Freire in the late 70s, right? And so he's frustrated. He finds Freire. He has like this, if you read his description of the first time he read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he had a religious conversion, no doubt. Like he's religious mania. He might as well have got baptized in the Jordan and come out of a zealot. He's on fire for Freire. And so you read it and you're like, this guy's weird, right? And so then he has this other time where he finally meets Paulo Freire in like the early 80s, and like he has him over to his house and they're like crying together all night and drink. It's really weird. And he writes this in a book. But anyway, he said that his most important praxis, he knew that he wanted Paulo Freire taken seriously, and Paulo Freire was not being taken seriously in any education publication or any education school in the country. And so what he wanted to do was, he said that he realized that the way to get him taken seriously was to help get radical teachers who were like him, radical educators, tenured in colleges of education all around North America. And he says that from 1980 to 1985, he went around and worked to help get tenure for 100 professors. That is the long march through the institutions. He considered it his most important work in his life was to get 100 basically infiltrators into colleges of education, so that when Paulo Freire's 1985 book, The Politics of Education, was written, it gets a glowing review written in the Harvard Education Review, HER, and it gets adopted by a ton of colleges of education that now have professors in them that are tuned into the Freirean way. That's how it happened. That's how Paulo Freire got in. It didn't just kind of matriculate in from the air or some people read it. You had actual people who literally went around getting like-minded people into positions of power. That's called the long march through the institutions.
All right, I'm convinced. So I definitely think it's a thing in colleges. I think the hardest pill for people to swallow is whether or not it's present in K-12 education. So I would say I think it is, but the teachers don't know what it's called, because I went through Teach for America. I got a master's degree in 2015. in education. And I never heard his name, but now after learning more, I understand the concepts were from him. So for example, we learned that teachers should be the guide on the side instead of the sage on stage. Everything is very anti-teacher lecture. They call it student-centered. They're all about dialogues and talking, the restorative practices. So where have you seen actual teaching methodology impacted by our friend Paulo?
I mean, just to qualify, I'm not in these circles directly. So I just get people sending me stuff like, this is in my school, this is what my kids are dealing with, or I'm a teacher and this is the crap they make us do at our education program, or whatever. But the stuff you just said, I mean, we've already talked about culturally relevant pedagogy, right? That's Gloria Ladson-Billings. There's no denying that that's humongous, right? That's everywhere. Everybody knows it's everywhere. And they've got even spin-offs where it's culturally sensitive teaching instead, right? And then I forgot, there are a couple more that are like way out there that I don't think are mainstream. But, this has even generated more radical spin-offs. But culturally relevant teaching is Paulo Freire's Education for Liberation. It is his generative model repackaged in terms of identity politics or ethnic studies. It's literally that. And again, Gloria Ladson-Billings points to that directly in her own paper outlining the concept. So there's no doubt that that's what it is. So culturally relevant teaching is, you said, it's the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. Is that the phrase that you said? Yeah. Okay. So that's where Paulo Freire's idea is that the prevailing model of education is something he calls the banking model or banking theory of education, where the educator stands up and pontificates to the students as if he's depositing knowledge into their heads, like putting money in the bank. And then they're able to go spend that knowledge later because they had the money in the bank. So you have the teacher making deposits into the students, and the students are passive receptacles who are not engaged in the process, right? And so that's the sage on the stage. Instead of the guide on the side, he says instead what you should have is a democratic model of teaching. And in fact, the next word you said, that it should be based on dialogue, he called his model, his democratic model, which is what Henry Giroux called it. He called it democratic education or the democratic classroom. The student-led model is the democratic classroom. What he called it was the dialogical model. He said there are two approaches to education, just two. You can either have the banking theory, where the teacher deposits knowledge into the students, and including political theory and socialization, or you can have the dialogical model, where the student and teacher are in dialogue with one another. He wrote entire books about the dialogical model. Every single book he wrote talks about the dialogical model, and he wrote like 30 of them. And so it's not just pedagogy of the oppressed and politics of education, the dialogical model, where it's going to be a dialogue between students and teachers who are seen as equals, but that the students have the lived experience necessary to guide the course of the classroom, and then that the teacher becomes a mediator to knowledge. I don't know if you heard any of that phrasing. That's word for word out of Paulo Freire. He says that the teacher is not somebody who stands up and teaches, but is a mediator to knowledge. And he says specifically a mediator to political knowledge. And so that this is everything you just said, democratic classroom, dialogical model, it's all straight Paulo Freire. But what it's passed through is all these other filters, whether it's Gloria Ladson-Billings repackaging what he called Education for Liberation as culturally relevant teaching, which, by the way, was a repackaging of Mao's mass line. He doesn't call it mass line education. He just doesn't call it that. He calls it Education for Liberation, and she calls it culturally relevant teaching. Like I said, you have his dialogical model gets reframed as the democratic classroom by Henry Giroux. And so now you have the student-led classroom comes out of that as another linguistic shift and slight mentality shift in how it's presented. And it's all, even the phrasing that you use, that sage on the stage versus guide on the side thing. It's like, well, that's just banking model versus dialogical model program right there. I mean, it's just different words for the same thing. And I hate to say it, but this is a very common tactic. I don't even just think it's like, okay, Gloria came up with her thing and put her own spin on it and called it this, or used this specific term. And I'm not accusing Gloria Ladson-Billings of doing this deliberately, but there are evidences in this woke literature, maybe not specifically in education that I'm aware of, but there are evidences where they deliberately would obscure the ultimate source of their materials. They would say that if you get there were arguments in the early days of intersectional feminism that if you got your idea from Michel Foucault, for example, who's a French postmodern thinker, by the way, they all did. All of it is Foucauldian in nature, all of it. If you got your ideas from Michel Foucault, it is better to cite a woman who rewrote his ideas in a more accessible way later to make sure that the citation credit goes to a woman than it is to give it to another white man in Michel Foucault, which you can say that's them practicing what they call citation justice or whatever, or research justice or whatever. But as a matter of fact, it's also called covering your tracks, right? Because if you go read, the first time I read Paulo Freire, somebody was like, you got to read The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I was like, okay. And I opened this book and I'm like, what the hell? This guy's just outright citing Marx, Lenin. He's citing Lenin. What's going on? How is an educator? He doesn't cite a single education theorist, not one, but he talks about how Lenin organized things and he's not disapproving. I'm like, what's going on here? He's citing Mao. He's citing Lenin. He has entire, like, I don't know, hagiographies of Che Guevara. Like, he just writes just how great Che Guevara is and how he's like the true embodiment of love for the people and the embodiment of what an educator should be. And it's like, what the hell is this? So there's a lot of people who would have read him and been like, what the hell is this? So then you have Henry Giroux write it without ever mentioning any of that crazy stuff. Never says it. He just, oh, we have a democratic classroom and this is how it's going to work. And it's going to be based on dialogue between students and teachers as equals. And then they say cute stuff like, I have learned as much from my students as they've learned from me, which is like, you suck as a teacher then. I'm sorry. Like, I get the sentiment, but like, you grew a lot dealing with people, but on your subject matter, you should definitely not be learning more about your subject matter from your students than you already know. It should definitely go the other way. If you're teaching third grade math, you should probably have enough of a grasp of mathematics to where they're not pulling out like an unknown proof of the twin prime conjecture that blows you away or something.
Absolutely. And I'm kind of wondering, I think some people would argue that maybe it has those roots, but it's been so watered down and it's morphed so many times that it's ineffective yet harmless. What would you say to people that say, yeah, well, maybe it came, 3 steps down, but it's not anywhere near what was originally intended? Would you go for that argument? Or would you say the fact that the poison's in there, it doesn't matter if people don't know it, they're still replicating it?
I'm with the second of those. It's like, it's definitely having an effect. Like, it doesn't I'm trying to think of ways to say this that are less colorful than the ways I'm thinking to say this, but I'll just say it. If you put a turd in a pretty box, it's still a turd in a box, right? And so it doesn't get better by giving it a prettier name. It is not watered down at all. It's just as radical. It's just in much more gentle and therapeutic language, which is actually more, it's like, here's a different metaphor. If you're trying to give your dog a pill, a dewormer or whatever, right? Your dog probably isn't going to, how do you get a dog to take a pill? Everybody knows how you get a dog to take a pill. You put it in some hot dog. All this soft therapy language is like the hot dog around the pill, but the pill's still in there. The pill didn't go away. It just made it easier to get into people, right? So that like I said, if they went and read Freire directly and were like, he cites Mao for his model, like maybe this is a bad idea. But they read Henry Giroux and he doesn't ever do any such thing. And it sounds very intellectual and smart. Now it's like putting a little bit of cheese or hot dog around the pill of Maoism. And like I said, Mao appears in particular, he's mentioned a few times, but he appears in the most relevant section in a footnote in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He's mentioned other times. Turns out Paulo Freire was a big fan of the Cultural Revolution, and he says so repeatedly throughout his books. But in the part where he says my model was based off of Mao, that's a footnote. So you might glaze right past it, right? But with Henry Giroux, you don't get the mention at all. It's not even brought up. So you would actually have to go do your homework, but you've done that after you've already kind of accepted the model. And so when you go back and you read Freire, you're like, yeah, he says this stuff, but I already kind of get it. And that's a little bit crazy, but we don't have to go all the way there. And they think you're watering it down, but you're not. But how do we know that it's having an effect? I mean, not to be super religious, I don't know where this podcast goes in that, but Jesus said, judge them by their fruits. And I think it's one of the most wise things in the world for telling whether or not something works. Did it work? Judge it by its fruits. See what happened. And so what would you predict if you were to look at a education model like Paulo Freire's, where you use, in his own words, you use the academic material as a mediator to political knowledge, that the goal is no longer to convey the information as a primary goal, the educational information, but rather that the goal is to awaken a political consciousness and then have excitement about learning follow from that. So the primary goal now is political consciousness, not academic mastery. Then that the academic material is an excuse to do that. This is his own formulation. If you were to say, take whatever education system you think we have in the world, or the best ones you can imagine, and swap it out and put that in, what would you expect? Well, you would expect students who sometimes can't read. You'd expect students who are not necessarily proficient in mathematics and science and all these things, because the academic material is a secondary concern. But you would also expect a higher proportion of students who are activist minded, who are willing to show up, go immediately after school to a protest, to see things in terms of this kind of black and white, very Manichaean struggle in society, to adopt a social dynamic of friend versus enemy, of allies and haters, and so, or allies and oppressors. And so these are the fruits that we see. Now, it turns out that a German education group did an experiment with, literally, it's not exactly like controlled, but they did a experiment. They went to, if I'm not mistaken, I cannot remember for sure, but I believe it was Kenya, but it may have been Zimbabwe. I'm almost positive it was Kenya. And they had these like pilot schools set up where you literally have people who like can't read, and they're going to teach them to read as kind of, educational outreach to this country. And they did a test, and they set up Paulo Freire based programming where they gathered the 17 generative methods that Paulo Freire recommends, had them focus on these words. They were going to teach them to read those words by getting them excited about it. And it turns out you can go read about this. I cited it in Marxification of Education. I think I almost opened Marxification of Education with it. What happened was a disaster. It turns out that the students were successfully radicalized. These poor Africans that came to learn to read, adult learners who came to learn to read, were radicalized. Then they broke down in emotional crises and they threw giant fits, and none of them learned to read. None of them even wanted to learn to read. They were like, why would you want to teach us to read when there's all these problems in the world? When we're being cheated, when we're being exploited, we're going to learn to read now? No, we don't want that. That's just more of the oppression. So what you would expect is what experiment bears out, and is what we see in our own education system. Our own education system, especially since 2015, and especially since 2020, has fallen off of a cliff in terms of academic mastery on virtually every subject. You're talking about school districts in some cases that have 0 students operating in certain grades at grade level in reading and or math. Nationally, it's something like 1/3 of our students are operating at grade level in reading, and slightly less in mathematics. You have school districts in Rhode Island that have like 6% of the students operating at grade level in mathematics, 15% or fewer in reading. I mean, this is catastrophic. And yet they're all activists. In other words, you get the radicalization, you get disinterest in education. Plus, it's not just disinterest, you're wasting class time. I give an example in Marxification of Education. I've given this example a bajillion times. Turns out this is from a real teacher training. Okay, so what does this look like? Yeah, I know that, you probably are interested in what it looks like in the classroom too. So teacher training, this is a real CE course for real teachers. It was held in the state of Indiana 4 or 5 years ago. This was a real example. It was, let's consider this mathematics word problem. It's a 2nd grade level problem. Everybody can do the math. It's an adult, almost, maybe not Gen Z, but it says Johnny is riding in the car with his mom and dad on the way to the amusement park, and the amusement park is 50 miles away from where they started, and they've already traveled 30 miles. How much further is there to go? And so, I mean, I used to teach math. I know exactly what you're supposed to do here. The goal is to help the student learn to read the words, to see the subtraction problem buried in it, extract the subtraction problem, solve that, and then express the problem or the answer to the problem back in words. There are 20 miles left to go because 50 minus 30 equals 20. And that's the goal, right? That's the pedagogical purpose of the word problem. Well, what these teachers were being taught in this social emotional learning, mandatory social emotional learning CE course, what they were being taught was you use the generative themes in the setup to the word problem as an opportunity to have important conversations with your students. You, for example, say, wow, guys, let's get engaged with the material in an amusement park. This question's about an amusement park. Isn't that cool? Isn't that interesting? Who's ever been to an amusement park? Totally innocuous question. Well, the thing is what happens is some kids raise their hands and some kids don't, because they're 7 All right. You can probably guess by the time they're 14 that most of the kids would have been to an amusement park. You can probably bet when they're 5 in kindergarten, most of them probably haven't been. You get around 7, 8 years old, that's when a lot of parents take their kids for the first time to an amusement park. And you're going to get a pretty good split. In other words, you're going to get a stratification in the classroom. You're going to get a difference. And then what the teachers are taught, although it wasn't explicitly said, is they're taught to shift from the word problem, which is the math part, to the difference. They're taught to shift to the difference. Oh, wow, guys, some of you have been and some of you haven't. That's really interesting. How come some of you guys haven't ever been to an amusement park? What are some reasons why people might not be able to go to an amusement park? So now you're talking about the difference. You've introduced to 7-year-olds a feeling of unfairness. Some kids got to go and some kids didn't. That's not fair. Sometimes they're primed to say, that's not fair. Not everybody gets to go. How come? And then they were taught in this teacher training, again, in the great state of Indiana, not a renowned like left-wing bastion. They're taught to continue to ask different, kids are going to say what kids are going to say. Who knows what's going to come out of their mouth at 7 years old? They're taught to keep asking until somebody says something that primes for a discussion. Not everybody can afford it. My parents won't let me. Something like that. And then you have a discussion. Oh, yeah, guys, it's true. Amusement parks are really expensive. Not everybody can afford to go. But that's not really fair. How could we make it so more people could go? How could we make it more fair? And they're taught to prime the kids to give answers until they say something. This is the teacher being guide on the side, by the way, instead of sage on the stage. And they're taught to keep asking students for suggestions till somebody says something like it could be free, or the government could pay for it, or something like that. Or anything that gives them the opportunity to suggest something socialistic. Then 5, 6, 7 minutes in after the engagement, you go to, okay, let's turn our attention back to solving the word problem. And then you do that. And you have not just amusement park, which is totally innocuous, but mom and dad and car. If you want to have an environmental conversation, you bring up something about the car. Hey, in science earlier, we were talking about the environmental impact of cars. Is it good that one family is driving all the way to an amusement park 50 miles to go to have fun? Is that good for the environment? And then you can have that conversation. And so this is the way that it plays out. But even if it didn't work to radicalize students and make them, as happened in the African situation, the Kenyan situation, disinterested in learning because they're now radicalized, conscientized, emotionally distraught, emotional crisis about the unfairness or whatever. Even if that didn't happen, you just wasted 7 minutes of class time. With a second grade class, you could have done 1 or 2 more word problems, got 1 or 2 more levels of practice. So instead of doing, 5 or 6 to get them to get the hang of it, or 10 in the math lesson for the day, or however many you'd be able to work through, you have time to do 2. And so they're just getting less math instruction because you're having time to have political conversations with them, which will radicalize some of the students, especially if you get into hot button issues like LGBT and all of that. And so you would expect lower mastery in academic subject matter and higher degrees of radical activism in the student body, not to mention maybe other disruptions. What do we see? You can't guarantee that getting the expected outcome is caused by the thing. I'm not saying that this is a succinct proof, but if we judge by the fruits, we're seeing what we should expect to see from this methodology. And if we had a more rigorous methodology, we know that we would expect to see something different because we used to get something different. We used to actually see rising up until roughly actually No Child Left Behind. We actually saw generally, which was a gameable accountability metric that George W. Bush put into play for the Department of Education. We saw generally rising outcomes in a lot of these different, academic masteries. And then they start going down once the gameable metric comes in, and then they start going down rapidly after this kind of programming gets introduced, not just with Common Core near the end of the Bush years, but with 2015 with the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then, like I said, once COVID hits, obviously COVID becomes its own variable, but all of these metrics fall off of a cliff. This is also when social emotional learning gets fully mainstreamed as transformative SEL, and you're doing way more social and emotional, I will say, engineering in the classroom. And just as a matter of consequence, less time for academic instruction, you're going to see declining mastery. And if this radicalization program works as well on children as it did on African adults, we can expect that you're going to see a concomitant increase in radicalization, which we do see. So I would say that the pill's in the hot dog, and it's definitely getting down some kids' throats, and it's definitely working.
Okay. I want to tweak your theory a little bit and tell me what you think. Okay.
Sure.
This is what I think is happening. I think there's 2 problems. there's the bad methodology of student-centered teaching that is meandering and wastes time and doesn't like drills and solid facts and wants to talk through things slowly. And I do agree that that wastes a lot of time and it's just ineffective and whatever. So I think that is real. I think there's a rise of maybe teachers that want to insert politics into the classroom, but I think that that's very new and still relatively rare. I think the real thing that's happening is our culture as a whole is radicalizing students, and it's kind of like the chicken or the egg argument. I think that that's getting into schools. Our schools are responding to society. There's probably parents that are wanting to see certain things, and there's parents that are not wanting to see certain things. And so I think the only danger kind of in this topic is that there's a large segment of society that really thinks teachers are indoctrinating students. And I would say, like, I'll be generous and say 95% of teachers, I don't think that that's true. I do think that there's a rising activist class of teachers, especially the youngest ones. They're the ones that get famous on like libs of TikTok. But I really do think the biggest problem and why scores are so terrible is these crappy methods, which appear to have come from Paulo Freire, like not liking the banking method, not liking lecture and drill and skill and all of that. And so I struggle a little bit because I get thousands of comments, saying like, teachers are indoctrinating. You're trying to make my kid gay. And I'm just like, I assure you, I can barely get them to do their homework. I'm not trying to make your kid gay. However, though, I think that there's a real like seed that is blossoming and eventually it's going to be a tree. So if you talk to me in 20 years, I think maybe the activist class of teachers will be way higher. And I think the forced implementation of activism will be much higher because I left in 2021 and I was starting to see the seeds blooming. We had, it was called Critical Conversations Beyond Diversity. That was our training. And that's that had the whiteness stuff and all of that. And they did say in these trainings that eventually the plan is for us to start talking with students about this in all subjects. And this was around 2021. And so now that I've been gone for a few years, like maybe that percentage has gone up. And so I think the problem is real. I think the agenda is real. I think the push from school districts is real, but I still think, and this could be, maybe I'm too close to the teaching profession to see objectively, but just for what I've seen and experienced, it's like, I was never talking to kids about like politics. I would like behavior was so bad. Kids were already coming in 3 to 4 years behind in reading, and there was just like all of these ineffective strategies that were being forced upon us. And so I think that that was more than enough to account for, most school districts barely having 30% proficiency. And I think a lot of the radicalization is coming from music, movies, TV, TikTok, social media, the public discourse that they're hearing from their parents. So what do you think about my theory?
I agree with you, actually. And I mean, I've been kind of painting the picture of what's in the literature and kind of how it has been implemented and the fact that teachers are being subjected to these trainings. But I agree with you about the proportions. It's certainly, in my estimation, I don't know now, but I would agree with the 5 to 10% of teachers are going in to be as activists to be activists. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, obviously that means most teachers are not doing that. And on the one hand, and, it means also that not every student is going to be exposed to such a teacher, although some will. Mm-hmm. And those problem teachers definitely exist, and they exist kind of on, not to be like this, but like on a spectrum where they're just kind of activisty all the way up to where they're like kind of psychotically abusing the position that they're in. They call themselves co-conspirators, in fact. And the definition of a co-conspirator is, for example, in these states that have banned CRT in the classroom or whatever else, what a co-conspirator is somebody who is willing to implement it, knowing they're breaking the law and might get in trouble. And so they're willfully conspiring with activists and other groups to undermine, state law. So that's like on the far end of the spectrum. But I think I would say that there's probably less than 2 on average per school, right, of such characters. They're very rare, but they exist. There is a incentive structure, especially now, where it's kind of rewarded for activists to go into education, which is that they have a opportunity to indoctrinate or rewire the next generation or whatever. So some are there. I don't think it's predominant. And I do agree with you, actually, that the school is actually, this is, I think, where a lot of parents get things wrong. The curriculum is messed up, though. We should just point that out. The curriculum is messed up. The strategies for dealing with the problems that exist, which are compounding, are all wrong and messed up. A lot of them are Freudian in their orientation or critical in their orientation. But the ultimate, like, where are the kids getting radicalized? Where are the kids getting these crazy ideas in a lot of cases? And the answer is almost certainly social media, overwhelmingly. Also some traditional media, whether it's their kids programming or whatever else. We keep seeing these scandals, whether it's Miss Rachel did this week, or whether it's, Blue's Clues had this the other week, or whatever. It's getting tucked into, like, I mean, I remember seeing some Muppets Kids, and it was like transgender Gonzo, and I'm like, what's going on? And so, like, this is coming in, but I've worked a lot with the detransition group. I don't think they're a community. Maybe they are kind of a community. I don't like that word, but there are a lot of detransitioners. So that means, what does that mean? Because this is not a word everybody still recognizes. It's people who went onto the gender transition pathway, then left. They desisted or otherwise got out. They don't identify any longer as the opposite sex or gender. If they're born female, they are back to identifying as female and no longer are pursuing that path. So that's the detransitioner. So I've talked to dozens of these people. I am friends with many of these people. They're a very interesting cohort. That's a better word than community, cohort. To a person, I've asked them, where did you get these ideas? Did you get the idea to transition? Did you get it from school? Did the schools, were there a primary vector? Was it from clinics? Where was it? Right. And it turns out that to a person, they all say social media first. Number one is social media, overwhelmingly social media. And like Chloe Cole is probably the most famous of these detransitioners. She's a friend of mine. And she said, actually, the school was the biggest resistance. It was actually in order. She got it from social media, and then she got the ideas from social media. She learned that she could think that way and maybe be that way on social media, started to pursue it independently as a teenager, as a young woman. And then had to overcome her parents, who were relatively skeptical but affirming of it, and then end up being massively encouraged by gender clinics, and then had the hardest time actually overcoming the school. So the school, even in California, where she was and still is, was still like reluctant to go along with this. Now, that's not the case in every school or every situation. A lot of parents are in the other situation. I'm friends, for example, with January Littlejohn, who's got a case at the Supreme Court, or going to the Supreme Court, about how her child was socially transitioned behind her back by the school, while openly lying to her as the parent about the fact that this was happening. I don't know where January's daughter got the idea to transition, but certainly the school was like on the front line of helping the program. Maybe she got the idea at school. I've talked to other parents who it was certainly a particular teacher, one of these, perhaps minority level activists, who had decided that they were going to, encourage a student to believe, maybe, you don't fit in because you're different. Maybe you should go to this after school club, the Gay Straight Alliance, or GSA is Gender Sexuality Alliance now. Maybe you should go to this, maybe blah, 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 blah. And so there are different vectors by which it happens, but if you were to ask me to prioritize it, the vast majority of it is not happening on the primary scale at school. It's the number one radicalizing vector for the kids in all regards is social media, followed probably by traditional media or broadcast media, followed by somewhere in there come these clinics, right? The clinics are definitely doing this. Counseling is another one. Kid gets, whether it's social media or whatever, or maybe it's at school, gets confused, goes to their parents, is upset, well, let's see about talking to a therapist. The therapist then pushes them into this rather than pulling them out of it. So there are a lot of pathways by which it happens, but I actually don't believe that the school is a primary driver of it. In fact, most teachers are not. A lot of them are handcuffed by policies, like inclusion policies, where they have to be very careful about how they deal with this if it comes up. I've talked to a lot of teachers, in fact, who are in the same position as parents, where they're being put unhappily in a situation in states like California or Colorado, where a child identifies as transgender or whatever, and then they are required by law or by school policy to lie to parents, and they don't want to. So you have teachers caught in this position as well. And that's, hard evidence that there's teachers who are not on board with doing this actively to kids. So it's a big, ugly, messy problem that kind of involves a lot of interacting pieces of society. But I don't think that our schools are willfully doing a lot of the kind of very manipulative Freudian stuff. Like I said, that example I gave from Indiana didn't come from a classroom. It came from a teacher training about how to handle a classroom. So let's say, I don't know how many teachers were there, but let's say it's 50. If 2 of the teachers decide to pick up that method, then you have 48 who didn't. So 96% of the room didn't go along with it. But then you also have 2 teachers who turn their classroom into a secret manipulative environment, who are probably going to encounter 100 students or so a year, more if it's high school, less if it's second grade. And so it's certainly there. I get really concerned more with the policies and the curriculum, because the curriculum, you use the idea of the seeds and the bloom and the fruit and the tree. I love that metaphor, actually, because and it's funny I'm saying this is also biblical, right? Because they talk about throwing the seeds, and where do the seeds grow? And the seeds have to land in fertile soil to grow. So what I see is with the curricular stuff and all these backwards methodologies, and a lot of teachers don't even agree with them, but they have to do a lot of it. It's just policy, or for the younger cohort, it's just how they were taught to teach. Right. Gloria Ladson-Billings, one of her 3 big papers in 1995 was titled, "But That's Just Good Teaching." That's just how you teach, right? That's the title of the paper. So it's what the curriculum and the pedagogy are doing is priming the soil. And then you have social media and traditional media and their parents and so on throwing seeds everywhere. And some of these catch in the soil. And so I see the curriculum stuff and the pedagogy stuff not as primary radicalizers, but as actually, think of it like plowing and preparing the field so that more seeds will be able to grow. And then you have problem teachers. And the main thing the problem teachers are doing is not just, you see these libs of TikTok teachers with their classrooms decked out, but the main thing that a lot of them are doing is shuttling the kids. They're like a screening mechanism. They're looking for the kid who's different or uncomfortable or whatever, and then funneling them to a more active indoctrination thing, like an after school program, like GSA or whatever. I think I'm not positive, but I would, if you ask me to bet on how I think it actually works, I think that's the story. So you have schools that are preparing the environment, not necessarily teachers who I talk to teachers actually a lot who are I don't want to do a lot of this. So I try to keep it on a minimum, but some of it we have to. It's just this is how the curriculum on social studies is organized now. And it's just what you have to cover. And so, they try to minimize and do the best that they can, but you have that plowed soil, and then you have some teachers who are actually active problems in these after school clubs and so on, but you have an entire environment that's bringing the whole picture in. And it doesn't help, actually, that our cell phones are, broadcast devices, and what every kid in the universe is chasing. Somebody told me the other day that the average Gen Z, so these aren't kids anymore, by the way. Gen Z is no longer children, but the average Gen Z is chasing. He said, we see views, he's a Gen Z himself, we see views on social media like oxygen. So anything that they can do to go get attention online, putting up a little video of themselves on Instagram, not all of them, of course, but lots of them are on this, dopamine treadmill of social media. And I hate to say it, but it rewards extremism. It rewards very, outlandish behavior. It rewards deviance. It rewards a lot of the kind of worst things that parents would try to shelter their kids from, but it's impossible to shelter your kids from social media too.
Absolutely. And so I think the question is, now we know that the ground has been, plowed. There's this vacuum for bad actors to come in and truly try to infiltrate education and truly try to not only have these weird, ineffective styles of teaching, but now to actually insert political messaging. And so I'm kind of curious, when you think of SEL or UNESCO or just different green agendas, what are some specific things that you've seen where you think, oh, this is a Trojan horse, this is not what people think it is?
Well, I mean, I think I've gotten in trouble for characterizing SEL as the hypodermic needle that injects the woke theory. You don't like that metaphor, you can go to, speaking of UNESCO, you can go to one of they have a publication, a magazine they publish called The Blue Dot. So you can go to one of their, they have an issue about, it's largely about SEL. Okay. And it's about social emotional learning and the uses that social emotional learning has, what it's for in the classroom, why it's such a valuable method, especially with regard to all this activism. And they talk about how the activism teaching activism and teaching the sustainable development goals. Actually, they call that education for sustainable development or global citizenship education. That those things, it says, create cognitive dissonance in the students. They don't know why they're having to learn about how to become an activist or whatever. And they are being thrust, as the educator Kevin Kumashiro, education theorist Kevin Kumashiro said, they're being thrust into emotional crises by being presented with evidence that suggests that they're somehow complicit in or trapped by systems of oppression. And so this long essay in The Blue Dot, which is the publication of UNESCO, says that social emotional learning's purpose is that it provides all of the necessary tools to enter into that state of cognitive dissonance into the students and help them deal with their dissonance and resolve it in a way that keeps them committed to the program. And they put out this whole thing with Einstein. They call it E equals MC squared, but I forgot what the E, the M, and the C stand for. But it is certainly not, energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. It is some, we're all sick of these, stupid, cutesy, woke things. It's one of those, whatever it is. But they have this whole model, and the idea is that social emotional learning, with its social and emotional tools as an explicit part of instruction, as they say, to be integrated into every single subject, not as a standalone, 30 minutes of SEL time every day, but no, it's going to be integrated into the teaching methodology of every single subject. They say that the purpose of one of the most powerful, valuable purposes of that is, in fact, to overcome the cognitive dissonance of trying to train kids to achieve the sustainable development goals as a educational opportunity or whatever. So that is concerning, but what's extra concerning is if you go to find that issue, if I'm not mixing it up with another one that's just as scary, it's possible I'm mixing two of them up here, but it shows a child on the cover of one of these issues, the Blue Dot, and I think it's the same one, but it might be a different one. It shows a child sitting, and he has a slot on the side of his head, and they're plugging a microchip into the side of his head that says stuff like, climate change and all of the different, like, kind of racial justice and all this. And they're reprogramming your kid. That's the image that they chose to use for this magazine, where they're discussing the purposes of this. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, I think SEL is, I believe these people when they write things like that and they make images like that. I'm like, this is how they see their program. They see it as a manipulative tool to keep their agenda going when children's psychology rejects it. Kevin Kumashiro, like I said that the point of, he says specifically queer education, but we could elaborate to social justice education. He says the point is to bring students into a state of emotional crisis and then structure the environment around them so as to resolve the crisis in a direction that's positive, which is pro-social justice rather than reaction. He's very explicit about what he means. That's in a paper he wrote in like 2002 or 3 called Against Repetition. Again, avoiding the problem of reproduction. And it's against the repetition of the existing society. And I'm like, holy crap, like that's trauma bonding. Like they're traumatizing kids on purpose in order to get them to think differently on issues of political relevance, conscientizing them, as Paulo Freire. What am I supposed to do with this? So I think social emotional learning is a powerful vehicle to get into the literally, that's a psychological, social, and emotional architecture of kids and get them attached to these various narratives, overcome the various psychological issues that they're having with the curriculum maybe being geared in that direction, but B, the rampant behavior problems that are happening at school as a result of the restorative justice programming, which doesn't work. I mean, it would be cool if it worked. And it's not to say it doesn't have a place in certain circumstances, because it does. But as a primary methodology for dealing with certain, behavioral issues, it doesn't work. Like some kids learn how to game it. Oh, I'm just going to have to sit down and have a little conversation with the person, and I can give them more trouble. So they learn how to game the system. They learn that they're not really going to get in any meaningful trouble. The schools, on the other hand, use it as an excuse to just not punish people and to cover up bad behavior, because once there's a measurement and there's a policy, then they want to maximize according to the policy so they can game the numbers. Max Eden and his co-author, I'm trying to think of who his co-author was, wrote about this in the book Why Meadow Died in tremendous detail, some years ago. It's extremely thoroughly researched, extremely accurate. Anyway, this upsets kids that their classrooms are often, a behavioral jungle, and they're like, what do we do? And well, social emotional learning is like, now we have this whole program, and again, it's not always used that way, but it can be and frequently is used that way. There's this program where it's like, wow, the social emotional environment that you're in, both here and maybe at home, and everything's so political, and COVID was so stressful that we have to like intervene on your mental health, like kind of constantly in school. We got to use that to orient you toward certain social values, in particular responsible decision making. Well, that's okay. That's one of the 5 pillars of Castle's SEL. Social awareness is another one, and it's like, okay, responsible decision making according to who? Right? Like, how are we defining responsible here? That's actually really important, because relationship skills. How are we defining them? Are we defining them in terms of all relationships have a hidden power element to them, and therefore we have to be relational in that way, so that if I'm speaking with a woman as a man, that I have to take that into account and recognize my positionality, because now we're doing woke standpoint epistemology. Is that part of relationship skills? Is part of responsible decision making deciding to become an environmental activist? I mean, who gets to decide that? And that's the problem, is now you have this explicit programming that's creating an opportunity for values education where children are most vulnerable, and trying to teach them the so-called correct way to be. And then its whole gaming, its whole measurement system is like totally gamed, right? Well, how are the kids' social and emotional cues and health? And they take some measurement on some app or whatever on their phone. I forgot, Ninja or whatever it's called. They take these measurements, they get their little scores, and they find out what their scores are. And then to figure out like what the score is, they pass it through a freaking equity lens. And then they're like, oh, not a very equitable classroom. We need more of this. Then they tell, whether it's a federal government or whatever, we have these huge problems in social emotional department. We need more money. Then they get more. So they're incentivized to do this, and they get more money. Then they implement more of the stuff that's actually causing the problem in the first place. This is it's really a disaster. Plus, the whole time they're data mining your kids. So learning your kids' biometrics to how they respond to different learning environments, what on earth could go wrong with that? And so it's a really concerning situation, the social emotional learning. But then I just mentioned the other one, and not half, nearly all of the Republican states, and even to a degree, the Department of Education under Trump, have adopted this resiliency and youth mental health model. It's the same thing. It's just more opportunity for them to get inside the kids' heads and tinker in a place where, like you said, you can't teach these kids, like, you're trying to get them to do their homework. And like, what makes you cleared to get inside their heads and be a de facto mental health clinic with no license for that? Like, I'm sorry, I know a lot of teachers might want to believe that that's part of the role and it's a big problem, and so somebody's got to help, so I can help. You might be, but they're not licensed mental health professionals. They're not in a controlled clinical setting. They're not in a one-on-one setting, which is often what you need to intervene, especially with a child. Like, there's a raft of problems with this entire architecture, and it increases the scope, as far as the parental rights discussion goes. It increases the scope of what schools have in terms of their authority, which is to say the scope of which the state has in their authority over a child's rearing and upbringing, which traditionally, of course, was the domain of parents. And that's what the parental rights battle is all about. So now it's like the school has, for many generations, been given permission in loco parentis to watch, supervise, and educate children in subject matters, and maybe some basic, social principles, to do actually some intentional socialization of the children. And that's one of the reasons parents have sent their kids to schools for, as long as I know. I don't want to homeschool because I don't want them to be a weirdo. I want them to, integrate with society. That was a thing for decades. People said, okay, so they had some mandate in loco parentis to do that, or some, not mandate, some permission in loco parentis to be able to do that. But now we're expanding the scope of what they can do. So you have schools offering nutrition services in case parents aren't capable of doing it. You have them offering health services in case the parents aren't able to do it. You have them now leaning very heavily into mental health services. And increasingly we see, you know, opportunities in which the parents just get cut out of these discussions. That, of course, being the story with January Littlejohn's Supreme Court case. So what you're seeing is a greater encroachment or greater envelope of state programming falling over in the excuse that some kids maybe don't have it right. Some kids have a bad home environment, so the school can offer a proxy good home environment. We can be your mom now, and it's, I mean, there were people who put up signs like that, right? Teachers that were wearing buttons. I mean, they all made libs of TikTok, so they're not means all the teachers, but this is not the correct attitude. And when we see this expanding scope of state authority over the domains of raising a child, you have some real questions about why they're doing that, what they can do with that in not just positive ways but negative ways, how that, you know, ties back to, is this covert communism? Is a fair question. They called them community schools, which is kind of funny. They called them community schools, which operated very much like orphanages in Soviet Union. But the idea in the Soviet Union was that every school was basically like, the point was to free parents of the responsibility of parenting. I read a whole book about schools in the Soviet Union that just horrified me. It's one of the most shocking books I've ever read, because the whole point that this was a book it wasn't telling people how Soviet Union worked. This was written by the Soviets. The whole point was like, hey, parents, you don't even have to raise your kids. Like, you don't have to do it. The school will handle it for you. Well, if you have the school doing, you know, education, child supervision, and care, physical health, nutrition, mental health, and it just keeps expanding into more domains that they're handling. And it's like, what do you do, parents? Well, you know, make sure they do their homework, give them a bed to sleep in, but it's not hard to build dormitories later. Boarding schools already have that figured out. What's the point of parents? So is this covert communism? Well, that's an open question, actually. There are reasons to be a little bit interested and concerned. Is the state trying to cut parents out? And there are these papers that I've read in education also that talk about, you know, yes, actually, because the parents are not experts and the experts have master's degrees, so they're experts. But, you know, they say things like, well, there's three stakeholders involved in every child's well-being. Those are the parent, the state, and the child itself. And there's a balance of priority to these. And traditionally, it has been that the parents and the child figure out the priority schedule based on their age appropriateness. And we have some kind of rough, reasonable person standards. If it goes to court, you know, is it fair to let an 8-year-old walk all the way to the park or whatever, or not unsupervised? But with a 14-year-old, obviously they have more autonomy. If they have more autonomy, they have more responsibility. If they have more responsibility, they have more leeway and rights. But ultimately, the parents are legally responsible to the age of 18, at which point that relationship is legally done. And then on the other hand, the state was traditionally like the answer of last resort. You have abuse, like, across a identifiable threshold, and the state steps in. And these papers are arguing it's time to rebalance those three entities. The child, of course, should be primary, and then the state should probably, because of its, you know, role in providing so much expertise, should be displacing a lot of the lack of expertise of the parents. So it's like there are reasons to believe that the guiding lights behind some of this programming, not necessarily all of it, actually do have an agenda of robbing parents of their rights in the same way, in an identical way to the way the Soviet Union envisioned its role in education. So these are Trojan horse concerns at the very least. And like I said, social emotional learning, in my opinion, is completely inappropriate for schools. I don't think it should be there at all. This gets me in a lot of trouble with a lot of teachers who think that they're helping. And I understand that the challenges are high right now with kids having a very disrupted situation, especially through the last 5 years, through the political insanity we're all managing as best we can. I understand the impulse. It doesn't change my stance on the belief that in its appropriateness.
Absolutely. When you were talking about SEL, I thought of something that I've heard called the Hegelian principle, but it's basically create a problem, publicize the problem, offer the solution. And so with SEL, it seems like amplify the problem, talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and then you get the solution. And so I'm wondering, just in your own opinion, Where do you see all of this going? Because I've heard lots of theories, and it does seem like there is a huge rise in people really loving socialism and Marxism. I even see it reflected all the time in the comments, and that was not the case when I grew up. I graduated from high school in 2005, and everything associated with communism, socialism, it was only ever talked about in a bad way. But it seems like overnight it's the new thing, and people will say, well, no, like I'm a democratic socialist or this or that. And so I'm wondering, do you think that this is creating the framework for a true revolution in America?
I think we see that already playing out. So yeah, certainly. Like what's happening, for example, in Minnesota right now would have been completely unthinkable 10 years ago. It's not even imaginable that you would have average, and I'm just using Minnesota, by the way, because it's in the news right now and pertinent, and you have visible examples. We could come up with a bunch of others, but the idea that you would have suburban mothers showing up to provoke and battle federal law enforcement physically, if necessary, couldn't even have imagined this 10 years ago. Could not. And then all their language and talking points is all the language and talking points of Marxist theory to put it out. And so it's already happening. Like, but yeah, you look at the younger generations, and again, whether they cut left or right, you're seeing this, not just ambivalence, but positivity towards socialism. On the left, of course, they're seeing it through kind of a Marxist lens and socialism as traditionally construed. But on the right, there's, unfortunately, it's hopefully still mostly small, but there's a serious conversation happening in certain circles that it looks like the mainstream and the conservatives are rejecting, but not strongly enough yet. But there are serious discussions that are like, well, no, socialism is the right model. It's just who's to benefit. Can it be everybody? No, that won't work. It has to be a national socialism. And I mean, they're saying this with a dead straight face. Like they literally believe there are heritage Americans who are more deserving of the output of a society. And so they should have a socialistic circumstance for them that excludes all the people who are interlopers and outsiders, which is the National Socialist Program. So you are seeing this flirtation with socialism of a different color. You see them actually say things like Karl Marx had, these are people allegedly on the right wing that are saying that Karl Marx had the right criticisms, but the wrong solutions. And the reason, if you ask them what his solutions where they went wrong every single time, is that they weren't nationalistic enough. They weren't taking into account the valid groups of people who are to benefit from the state economy. And so you see this massive rise. And like I said, I think this is predictable from seeing this, whether it's in media or whether it's in school curricula and teaching methods. You can predict that people are going to become warmer to this way of thinking because the socialization hypothesis is not, it's not as deterministic as people think it is, but it is not zero. There is a degree to where, you know, people will accept the kind of cultural picture that they've been presented around them, especially when they're children. And so it's, you know, a very concerning situation. It appears that a very large percentage of the population, you know, probably a larger segment of the left than on the right so far, but that could change very quickly, is not actually aware of what our system is, how it works, why it works, what it provides for them, and are, you know, therefore siding with things like socialism and other forms of tyranny that, in one form or another, that threaten in large enough numbers to destabilize the foundation upon which our society ultimately stands, which is belief that the system that we have is a system worth having. If too many people don't have that belief, eventually the thing's going to fall out from it's like the floor is rotted out and it's going to fall down.
There's been a big push with equity talks in school, DEI, and in corporations. What do you see about that as problematic? And are there any alternatives to the concerns that people are bringing up with like race or wages? The grievances that they have, I think a lot of people would complain that, oh, well, the right never acknowledges that there's a problem, or it seems like they acknowledge it, but they don't care. So people feel like the only people that are proposing solutions are maybe people that are more Marxist in orientation. And so, what is wrong with the new equity movement?
I mean, it all starts down to understanding the words we're using, right? Because there are two meanings for the word equity. It actually took me a long time to figure out that there were two meanings to the word equity. I figured it out with other words like diversity a lot faster. Equity actually means getting something like, and I had intentionally add the word something like, there's a statistical element to it. It doesn't always work out. But if it were a perfect system, equity would mean getting out of a system something close to a proportional return on what you put into the system. How do you know that that's what it means? Let's just get some foundation under us. Okay, when you buy a house, right? So you go and you get a mortgage because you can't necessarily buy the house outright. Even if you could, that would still apply, but let's do the mortgage approach. So you get a mortgage and you pay your monthly, you have maybe a down payment, maybe you don't. You pay your monthly payment every month. Some of it goes to interest and some of it goes to principal. And the amount that accrues that has gone to principal between your down payment and then any subsequent payments is called your equity in the house. So let's say, the house costs $500,000 and you've paid $200,000 down toward principal. You have $200,000 in equity toward the house. If you were to go say that you needed a line of credit to be able to do other things, start a business or whatever, you could go to the bank and get something called a home equity line of credit. What does that mean? It means that you're using as collateral for that additional line of credit, which is not a loan. It's like a credit card in a sense with a much lower interest rate. It's a availability to spend somebody else's money. So you can go get this home equity line of credit, and the collateral against it is the amount of actual equity you have in your house. So maybe you haven't paid off your house yet. You have 200,000 out of 500,000 in equity. You can go to the bank and say, look, I have $200,000 of accrued value in my home that is mine. It is my equity in the home. Can I have a line of credit using that as collateral in order to be able to do other things? And then they would decide and approve based on whatever. So equity means kind of like getting equity in this case is literally how much you've put in. And if your house has appreciated, let's say 10% over time, by the time you get to your $200,000 that you put in, your actual equity is not $200,000 that you paid; it's $220,000. Same thing if you bought stock. What is your equity in the stock? It's the amount of holding that you have. So if the stock goes up in value, your equity goes up, the amount that you deserve for having invested or whatever else. So in kind of general principle, you can imagine that if I go do this much effort or I put this much activity out into the world, I have a reasonable expectation, which you might be wrong about, but we'll assume that it's reasonable to have this level of return. Getting that back would be equity. Okay, so equity means getting your fair share of something you've contributed to. That's the abstract definition. Well, the problem is in the field of public administration, starting in the 1960s, they adopted at what's called the Minnowbrook Conference. They adopted a new definition of equity for public administration, and that definition was given comparatively. The way it was given was, if equality means citizens A and B are equal, then equity means adjusting shares so that citizens A and B are made equal. How does that work? How in the world would you adjust shares to make people equal when the idea of, and call it equity, when the idea of equity is you're getting your fair return from your investment in something? Well, the only way that you can do that is by having an assumption that there is a fair return for existing within a society. Okay. And so the idea of equity took on a model that's called disparate impact. What they did was they started to look statistically. Everybody deserves at least the opportunity to have an equal share of the fruits of society. And if we look statistically, white people have this average income, black people have this average income, men have this, women have that. And there are inequalities there. The numbers don't come out equally, right? And so there's a lot of possible explanations for why that is. Some of them are benign, some of them are bad, some of them are discrimination. But the disparate impact doctrine that got adopted in law was that in any point, and this was by 1971, by the way, so Civil Rights Act is 1964. 7 years later, in 1971, the Supreme Court decides its first case. It's called Griggs versus Duke Power. That enshrines disparate impact into law, into the interpretation of civil rights law, I should say. And so what this is that if the doctrine says that if there are differences in outcome on average between groups, it must be that somewhere in there, even if you can't point to it or find it anywhere, discrimination is part of the cause, if not the whole cause. That gives an entitlement mentality as a downstream consequence, which is, I'm not getting my fair share. I'm putting X into society and I'm not getting X plus interest back, right? So I have less than I'm supposed to. So we need to adjust shares to make things more equal. according to usually demographic qualities, because the assessment is done by averages by group, where these groups are in some cases even ill-defined. So now you have this new mentality of equity, which is certain groups in the name of social justice, which is group fairness, are owed extra benefits in society, and that becomes the basis for a program of equity. It's no longer that each individual has a reasonable expectation to get a fair return on the investment they put into society. It's now that groups, if we have a truly equal society, should be getting an equal return from the society at large in very vague and very hard to define ways, like wages overall. That's an incredibly complicated thing. There's no such thing, by the way, as an average wage. We know what it is, we can calculate what it is, but nobody has the average wage. They have the wage for the job that they're working. It is an individual wage. It doesn't matter if that number equals the average wage. Nobody is earning the average wage. They're earning the wage for the job that they're actually working. And so it's a very complicated thing. And it's like taking like a smudge and just smudging out all the relevant details to say that we're going to adjust according to average wages, which is what the gender pay gap argument has sought to do. We don't know necessarily, from hearing the argument of 79 cents on the dollar, we don't know, for example, why that's the case. We don't know what it's even describing. Are we comparing comparable things, or are we adding in the comparison of incomparable things? And it turns out the answer is mostly that. And there seems to be the possibility of a small discrepancy of a cent or two on the dollar that might actually be down to unexplained fact, which may be discrimination. Who knows? I'm in favor of anywhere that you can find an inequity that can be actually identified as genuinely due to arbitrary factors, correcting it. How can you know that I'm in favor of this? Because we already do this with handicapped people. Handicap accessibility standards are in fact an equity program. We spend more money to make it equally accessible to people with handicaps. We prioritize parking spots in parking lots with high fines. We have all kinds of stuff laid out in cities, such as, those things under your feet where you can feel, so that blind people can tell where they are on the sidewalk, the street crossings making sounds, and so on. We have all kinds of accommodations that we build in, and we do so proudly. We are happy to do this. Why? Because we know that the environment itself, when you have a disability, puts a unfair disadvantage on people. The environment is, and we have the capacity to spend some money to correct for some of that. And so we think it's right to do. We also know that, for example, somebody having been in an accident and in a wheelchair, or being born without legs or whatever, has absolutely nothing to do with their mental capacity to do accounting or whatever. So if they want to come to the accounting office, making it able for them to get into the building without having to like crawl upstairs on their forearms like G.I. Joe, seems like a worthwhile thing to do. And so we spend money for this. This is equity in the other sense of correcting a disparate impact, and we're in favor of this. But the thing that where it goes wrong is that this disparate impact analysis definition of equity that redistributes by groups to make citizens, not true groups, equal, that got brought into public administration law and then got enshrined into law in the Griggs versus Duke Power, doesn't take into account any of these specific details, and creates a whole bunch of space for subjective and spurious arguments to be made. It's like, I didn't get a job that I wanted to get, and then if I can cry that it was discrimination, and I can say, well, there's a disparate impact for members of my unique group, therefore, I can win a discrimination lawsuit, then I can kind of cheat the system, when it might have really just been that I wasn't qualified for the job. So what you're able to do is, under this kind of doctrine, is to mix in a bunch of illegitimate claims with legitimate claims in a way that you absolutely cannot tell that that's how they work. Now, the other problem with it is that it had a name before it had the name equity in the United States. This exact program was called Faktическое равенство. In Russian, it means actual equality. It was the program of creating not just economic, but social, cultural, and demographic equality in Soviet Union across all the ethnic groups. It was literally already a program, and it was a Soviet program. And it was the point of like the second level of communism. The point was to get economic equality through force of government and economic law, and then to force social and cultural equality through this program that was called actual equality. That was the goal of the program. The program was called Koreanizacja. And so this is a Soviet program too. Like, what's wrong with it? Well, I don't know. Communism doesn't work. And in fact, communism always creates the same problems because it doesn't just not work. It doesn't work for very specific reasons. One of those reasons is what I just said. You have illegitimate claims mixed in indistinguishably from legitimate claims. That means you have grifters every time. And what grifters are is drains on your systems. You have people who then end up perceiving that they're breaking their backs working hard for do nothings to get their shares readjusted to, right? So citizen A is working hard and sees his shares being readjusted to citizen B and thinks that this is not fair. Guess what citizen A does? Works less because he thinks it's unfair. This in communism gets so extreme that, they did the collectivization of farms in, say, China, but also in Soviet Union. And you would have farmers go out and destroy all their farm equipment, all their shovels, all their plows. They'd kill all their animals. They'd burn down their house just so that it wouldn't get collectivized, because they would rather see it destroyed than watch it get misused by their neighbor who literally didn't earn it and who doesn't care about what quality it is. And so at the end of the day, it turns into a complete catastrophe. The model, everybody understands it from high school, I think, maybe not today, but back in the day, is the group project, right? You get 5 people in the group project. One of them is the A student who wants to get an A and is going to do all the work. You have 2 or 3 people who kind of help but don't really know what they're doing. And then you have 2 people who screw off and cause problems the whole time or won't do anything, and they get the grade. And so the person who has to work really, really hard gets the same grade as the person who doesn't work at all. And the people who kind of half-ass it, and that person, who's probably a girl, is mad. She's mad that she had to bust her butt to get a good grade. She had to do the work of 5 people because 4 of them didn't contribute at the same level that she would. So she gets disgruntled. And if she didn't have the idea of her grade hanging over her head, I guarantee you she'd quit. She'd just be like, I'm not doing this. I'm just not going to do it. And if you repeated the experiment enough times, eventually she is going to say, I'm not going to do it. And you know what? To hell with it. If they want to get Fs, we're all getting Fs. And this is what happens. And it doesn't work. Well, this equity program, which is based on the disparate impact doctrine, does that in a soft way. It's not as hard of a way as forced redistribution under the Soviet system or whatever. But sometimes the model is really blatant. Like you gave a couple examples earlier. It's just really blatant and blatantly unfair. And so this is why communism doesn't, well, one of the reasons communism just doesn't work. It expects human beings to behave in a way that human beings won't behave. Their incentives don't line up in the way that that we believe is moral and fair and just. And eventually we just say, to hell with it. We're not doing it. And everything falls apart. When you have the people who are capable and who are doing things say, I have a better deal by leaving than by staying, your society is going to fall apart. It's going to collapse. And this is the problem. And like I said, everybody who's a beneficiary of these programs, there might be some legitimate problems. There might be some percentage of hangovers of discrimination or real discrimination or whatever that are real issues. But what the problem is that these doctrines blur out all of the focus on the individual, turn it in terms of groups, try to do forced redistribution in terms of groups, and you end up with a massive amount of hangers-on and free riders and grifters and actual, like, worse than grifters, like opportunists who come in, take advantage of the situation, and basically spoil whatever good it was supposed to do. Imagine if with like handicap stuff, just with the parking spaces, if you just had a whole bunch of people who pretended that their leg hurt so they could have handicap parking spaces and just took them all the time, and made like a huge I mean, that's not a great example because it doesn't make a big enough of a problem to get people's attention, but you kind of get the point. It's like the people who get injured by this are the actually handicapped people who can't park in those spaces, and the people who care about them get mad about it, but then there's nothing they can do. And you can just see it just spirals into disaster. The solution's easy. Don't do group-based analysis. Do individual-based analysis.
Yeah, I recently read, I think it's called The Devil in Karl Marx by like Paul Kanger. And I was
Yeah.
also horrified at just like millions, hundreds of millions of people dying, just the way that they would control everything, just the spying, the control. That's the part that really freaked me out, and why that seems to replicate itself almost everywhere that there's communism. I don't know if there was something baked into what Karl Marx believed that created that. Do you have a theory on that? Like, why is it so bloody and militant and control based?
Well, the reason is because they believe that it fundamentally will work, and it will not work. Like I said, imagine you had this classroom situation, right, with a group project, right? And so you have the A student girl or whatever, and she like carries the group, and she's really upset about it, right? Now imagine it's a different kind of school. Imagine it's like, the world. And so after that project, she has the ability to say, you know what, I don't want to be in this class anymore because that's what happens in this class. I'm going to go to a different class. That would be like picking up and moving out of your country that's trying to force redistribution. So Soviet Union has group projects. They force redistribution. You say, I'm going to leave because, like, forget this. Well, Soviet Union knows it can't lose all of its or the classroom knows it can't lose all of its best students, or else it's going to be a real problem, right? And as a country, you're going to fall apart. So what they have to do, they have to force people to participate. So the totalitarianism comes in. They have to force people to do this because it doesn't align with their incentives. Their incentive structure that human beings have literally as a part of our human nature that will not change does not allow us to decide that we are perfectly willing to help people that we see as deserving. We are perfectly generous and charitable people for the most part. We are not all selfish jerks. But the fact is that when we are forced to give a portion of what we are doing to selfish jerks, we get real upset about it. We're very sensitive to this. And if you want to look at, maybe deep evolutionary reasons why, you can say God created us this way. But if you want to look at maybe evolutionary arguments like evolutionary psychology, if we grew up in a tribe and it's like marginal survival, and if people die, like everybody might starve, or you might get taken over by the neighboring tribe or whatever nasty, awful thing you don't want to have happen. And you have like 5 guys who just won't do anything, and they're just taking all the resources for themselves, or going around and eating all the food. They're taking stuff, they're breaking stuff, they're not contributing. Tribes dealt with this by throwing those people out. They exiled those people. They're like, good luck. And this is what they did. And this is how they dealt with the problem. You can't be part of the group because you're not going to pull your own weight. And they didn't serve this fate on like, the injured old lady. They generally took care of those people. So it's inbuilt in us for very deep reasons not to tolerate free riders and grifters and this kind of thing. So the whole program is built off of grift. I mean, you read The Devil and Karl Marx, so you know how Paul Kanger represented Karl Marx's personal life. Wouldn't get a job, wouldn't bathe, ran around yelling and complaining all the time, expected his mom, his dad, Engels, his wife's parents, whoever, to pay his way, to the point where Engels' longtime girlfriend / almost de facto wife dies. He's distraught. Karl Marx's first thing he writes to her is like, I'm sorry to hear that. You were going to give me money, by the way. Where is it? And it's just like entitlement, right? And so the whole program is built off of this. Is Karl Marx built a program that was, I'm smart, I have genius ideas, the system should give me a great living, I should be in charge of things. That's literally his mentality. But he's not producing anything of value in particular. He's not helping other people. So they have to force people to do it. So there you get the tyranny. But then it's worse, because the actual thing communists believe, when they're actually true believing hardened communists, is in fact, say we go back to our classroom and we have our girl who's like, I'm going to another class because this class is BS. I'm not doing this anymore, right? What they would say is she's selfish. She doesn't care about the grades of those other 4 people, especially those 2 that just don't want. She's selfish. She doesn't care. So she's going to go off to some other class and she's going to do it. She's the one who's wrong. And I said, well, human incentive structures don't work this way. They say human incentive structures are wrong. We need to, in fact, transform how human beings interact so that they understand. What Karl Marx's hypothesis is that human beings are intrinsically socialist, but we're also greedy for private property that we forgot that we're socialists. So we're going to force people to remember who they really are. And that's it. That's why it's not just like closed borders where you keep people in, not keep people out. It's not just like the Berlin Wall. Like every communist regime has had to keep people in. We're seeing this in California where they're trying this wealth tax, and what's happening? All the tech entrepreneurs are leaving because they're going to be bankrupt. It turns out communism doesn't work where you can't build a wall and force people to stay. So you see that in this tyranny to try to force people to work for the collective. But then ultimately what it's trying to do is transform human beings to be something other than they are. And when that doesn't work, it can only do one thing, which is to get more and more and more brutal, because it's unwilling to do the other option, which is to relinquish the theory. They can either say communism is wrong, at which point, by the way, they have no justification for their own being in power anymore. Therefore, we're not going to do it anymore. Or they can say communism is right and you idiots are wrong and we're going to fix you. And that's where you get the forced labor camps, the gulags, the re-education, the absolute brutality, the speak bitterness meetings to transform people's mindsets, the ideological remolding in China, in his thought reform prisons and brainwashing, which was called Now. It was actually part of the program. And we get the word brainwashing from Chinese communists, by the way. They called it wash brain in order to talk about how they would change people's fundamental beliefs. They called it recognizing one's crimes from the people's standpoint. So you had to learn to think like a communist. This is why it gets so brutal, because basically the human hardware rejects the communist software, and the communist won't reject it and forces it on everybody they have power over. And so this is why it ultimately gets as bad as it does.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm just curious whether it's parents or teachers or even students that are seeing the seeds of some of these ideologies. How do you think people can push back without looking paranoid? Because I feel like in the public, the discourse is always when people bring up Marxist or Marxism, they'll say, oh, they're paranoid or they're conspiracy theorists or this or that. How do you push back in a system like what we're seeing?
All right, there's two ways. There's the easy way and the hard way. So which means we need lots of people doing the easy way and some people doing the hard way, because it's not going to work. Everybody's not going to do the hard way. I just spent 2 hours demonstrating the hard way. You have to learn a lot about it. You have to be able to answer a lot of questions. You have to have a lot of details. You have to be able to say, here's where it is. This is what it says. This is what they did. This is how it connects. This is where the guy cited the other guy. This is what it, you have to be, there's not going to be that many people that are going to bother doing this. So we need some of those people. That's the hard way. They can push back because they are armed with that kind of material. All right, I lied. There's a middle way too. You're doing the middle way right here in this episode. You hosted this conversation in a way where people will see it, right? So the middle way is doing the work of presenting the people that are taking the hard way, the full-blown explanations that are kind of airtight, and getting that out there to more people. So that's a way people can push back. The easy way, however, is to offer something competing that's better and sell people on the better thing, right? Rather than saying, holy crap, this is communism, don't go there. Looking at that 45 or whatever percent of the population who thinks socialism is the right way and saying, look, whatever you think, but there's a better way. And here's what happens. And that better way is, whether it's free enterprise or freedom or liberty, but you have to also be able to articulate why. So you have to learn a little bit about why, common sense, free enterprise, private property, and so on, do things like lead them in the direction that they actually want to go. That can be talking about historical examples for comparison, but it can actually just be like, very basic arguments about, why does free enterprise generate wealth? Well, because what are you trying to do in life? Ultimately, most of us are trying to solve problems. Most of the time we have problems. We want to solve them. We're bored can be a problem. We need something nice for our living room so that we're not looking at a bare wall as a problem. Or, there's floodwaters coming into my basement is a problem. My toilet overflowed, that big problem. It's a very urgent problem. We have problems we want to solve. We need shelter over our head. We need clothes on our back. We need food in our mouths. These are persistent problems that do not go away. We have problems. We want to solve the problems. How do we solve the problems? We have to put effort into solving the problems. That effort can be symbolized by money, where you spend some money, hire a plumber, and he comes and fixes your toilet because you don't know how and you need it done right now. Or it can be, well, I needed to patch my roof, so I went on YouTube and I learned how to patch a roof, and I got the materials, and I got a ladder, and I got a hammer, and I patched my roof. It can be whatever, but you're putting effort into it, right? Now, let's say that you have a problem and you want it solved, right? Well, here's the thing. You're incentivized to solve the problem because it's your problem, right? The government, it's not the government's problem. The government doesn't want to solve your problem. You might be able to convince them to solve your problem when they get around to it, but you're also going to want to solve it good. Government doesn't live in your house. They don't particularly care how they solve it. So they're going to solve it minimally. You want to solve it at a minimum of expense. The government's not spending its own money. It doesn't care how much money it spends. It's not going to solve it efficiently. You want to solve the problem in a way that takes advantage of materials you already have. The government doesn't care. It will do whatever it wants. So you have all these incentives to do things, and maybe you figure out, a clever solution. Maybe you just solve your problem better, faster, and cheaper than other people could do it, or you have the money that you've earned doing other things to hire a contractor who can come in and do it, or an engineer who can do it, or whatever the thing is. Or you just go to the store and buy something to put in your living room because you have money, because you earned it doing something valuable. You have the freedom to do that. But maybe you have a problem and you solve it and you're like, oh, wow, this is a clever way to deal with, security from my online banking thing. I'm going to make an app, and you get a programmer to work with you and you build an app and you sell your app and you make a whole bunch of money on your app, because what you did is you figured out a way to solve a problem for you that other people have. But you own the property rights to that because private property exists. And then you have now innovated. You came up with a solution to your problem in a new way that's valuable to other people. But because you own the property rights to it, you get to decide how much people are going to pay to have access to your solution to their problems. Now, notice, like with our student in the classroom example we had a minute ago in the group setting, she's apparently wrong for not caring about the guy who won't do any homework, right? Her values are wrong. Well, with this system, you don't have to care about. You can solve problems for people you don't care about. His problem is that he needs a better grade so he can pass or whatever. Well, she's supposed to care about him. And you can't get people to care about people who won't care about themselves after a while. But in this system we call capitalism, when you produce some kind of a valuable solution to some kind of a problem, which can be providing labor for somebody that's running a company, that's a problem they have. They need labor. They'll pay you for it. When you solve a problem for somebody, they'll pay you for it. If you solve a big problem for a lot of other people, nobody has to care. People can care and people do care, but nobody has to care about anybody to solve each other's problems. Now, here's the problem. In a family, everybody cares about everybody else. In a society, most people don't even know each other. There's no reason to care about each other. And, you see these memes in the right wing, and some of them are pretty extreme, but it's like, they'll show a picture of Karl Marx and it'll say something like, are you saying you care more about being able to get, lunch at whatever than about 25 million starving kids? And it's like, dude, I don't even know those kids. That's real, by the way. That's real. People care about their own system first, their own circuit first. And they're always going to. And beyond a certain range, they don't have the capacity. They can only care abstractly. So they don't really care. And I can't solve, if I had the capacity to solve 25 million hungry kids, I would solve it. But 25 million is a lot of kids. I don't have the capacity to solve that problem. And me yelling at the government to solve that problem doesn't produce good solutions. So this isn't a great way to go about things. Instead, if I can find a way to holy crap, if we package meals this way, you can get them out a lot cheaper. Now somebody can come in and feed a lot more of these kids, or they can afford a lot more things. I've solved a lot of people's problems and they're willing to pay me for it, and I'm going to make money off of it. So I'm incentivized to do it for me rather than having to make up some abstract concern that either I can't find or I can't maintain. So in society in general, maybe you care, maybe you have the biggest heart in the world, and bless your heart for it. Most people don't, and most people won't. And you still have to work with the army that you have. And the army that you have is not selfish. They're human. They're normal. And normal people, to help a stranger, have to be incentivized through self-interest to help somebody they don't know or don't care about, or even, believe it or not, don't like. I can make a product and sell it to somebody I don't like because I like their money. I might want them to live in their problems and suffer if I really don't like them, but I still like their $20, so I'll still sell them the solution to their problem. It's amazing what magic that is. So this is a completely different system, but the system only works if there's private property, and the private property is the capitalist system, which is the anti-socialist system. It only works if people can say, look, this is my stuff. You have your stuff. We get to negotiate and set the terms of exchange between us because it's my stuff. You can read this, by the way, in the paper Whiteness as Property, which is by Cheryl Harris. It's a foundational text in critical race theory. She says that whiteness is a form of property. What makes property property legally? One of the things that makes private property private is the fundamental right to exclude. I'm telling you right now, the fundamental right to exclude other people from your stuff is the foundation of all wealth, all abundance, all prosperity, all civilization, the foundation of it. And it's not hard to work out the reasons why. I just kind of walked you through some of it. But it's basically, if I make something and it solves your problem and I say, well, I'll give it to you for $20. And you're like, but I have this problem. I'm like, all right, fine, $19. I can do that. But if you're like, you have to give it to me, and you pull out a knife, I can call the cops and put you in jail for that, because my property right is going to be secured by the government. And the government's not out to solve any of my problems except the securing of my fundamental rights. That's the American system. And guess what it does? Produces massive prosperity and abundance. How do we know? Judge them by their fruits. What do we have? The most prosperous country in the history of the world that's not perfect by any means, but it has certainly generated more opportunity, more prosperity, more abundance, and more peace and safety, not just for us, but for people all around the world than any other country in history. You say, well, what about all these countries that they've waged war on and regime change and they've done all this bad stuff? I didn't say we're perfect. I said better than any other country in history. I guarantee you, China's a communist country. Look at their human rights abuses. We're doing a lot better. If you had to choose which country do you want to have run how the world actually works, do you want a country like China that's going to exploit every country it can through heavy debt diplomacy? You want a country like America that deploys its naval fleets to protect everybody's ability to do maritime shipping? It's not a really hard choice.
So when people say, like, people will write in the comments and they'll give me like obscure European nations and say, well, like, what about Denmark? Or there's democratic socialism? Or what about these countries with socialized healthcare? What is your argument to those people?
I mean, it's an old trope, but it's true. You can only spend other people's money for so long. It's the same thing. It's like, fine, your society has decided that it believes that it's getting a net benefit by being the A student who's carrying other people in the class. That's fine. And that lasts as long as it lasts. But eventually, that person gets burnout. And when we're talking about an economy, the people getting burnout are people that are wealthy producers who build systems that create lots of jobs for other people, lots of opportunities for other people, and they leave. They just leave. It's not worth it to keep doing this after a certain point. And that's a problem. So as long as you can keep them, wrapped up into the program, cool. This is why the right wing argues for National Socialism, and they say that the nationalism is the solution to the part where socialism doesn't work. They're very clear that the reason that socialism on the international Marxist scale doesn't work is because it makes you care about people who aren't part of your family. So let's say it's Denmark, so they can put out a huge, nationalist campaign, Denmark for the Danes or whatever it is, and they push this really hard, and everybody has great national pride, and they're willing to sacrifice for their country in the same way that they're willing to sacrifice for their family. But we're not actually talking about a family. We're talking about a society, which is the group homework problem much more than it is an actual family. And after a while, that sentiment can no longer carry some elements of the most productive aspects of society. You say, well, that means they're selfish and bad, so we should tax the rich or eat the rich or kill the rich or whatever. Well, first of all, you don't really want to do that because you're just going to make your country more poor. But second of all, they're not being selfish. They're being burned out by a system that's actually exploiting their generosity through, nationalistic fervor or whatever other thing. Plus, by the way, National Socialism is not a great solution. This is the solution they think makes it work. It still doesn't work because you still grind people down. The best thing to do is still to incentivize people. Now, what those Nordic states, Denmark, the Norway, Sweden, what they do in the Netherlands, what they do better than a lot of other countries with their socialism is they make it very visible what people get for their extremely high tax dollars. People know what their tax dollars are paying for, and they see the benefits of them. It doesn't mean that it's like great or that it's going to work. It's just much more successful than, say, paying billions of dollars in taxes in the state of California for a railway that never got built, right? And where did all the money go? Well, it went to somebody. It went to all these contractors who didn't do anything. And you see all this, graft happening. That's not going to work. They have a better system in knowing where that money is going and what they're getting for it, but it's still a system that burns out the high talent. Norway has one of these high wealth taxes. All of their big entrepreneurs left, all of them. They have zero tech entrepreneurs in particular because tech has this high balance of a situation where you hold lots of shares of a company that's valued at something, but you have very few liquid assets. So when you have a wealth tax on your company, you end up with a very high personal tax that goes way beyond your own assets. So they all left. There are basically no tech entrepreneurs left in Norway, which means they do not have a vibrant tech sector, which means their tech sector will not grow. And eventually everything starts to decline when your sectors start shutting down. So it works as long as it works. It works as long as you can keep people invested emotionally in the program, which means that they have to see that the value to that is greater. Some altruistic program is greater value than, their own well-being and the fact that they're getting taken advantage of, which they will eventually realize. And then, like with, the healthcare systems, you literally have to deal with the fact that you're spending other people's money and eventually you run out of it. And this is where the big problems in, say, these European countries and then Canada in particular are kind of coming to a head where they brought in so many migrants who are not net contributing to the system, that the system with all the free healthcare and other free benefits has become so expensive that actually they're running out of other people's money very quickly. People want to make it about demography. There are other issues involved, of course, as well. Economically, one of the biggest problems, or certainly the biggest problem, is that the system itself becomes too expensive to support what you have. Would that have happened had they brought nobody in? Don't know. Maybe not. But what you will likely see in such a situation is a general tall poppy where the richest people are disincentivized. Your super highest A student is disincentivized from helping the group. So they decide that, at the end of the day, they're going to work this hard and then they're going to take it easy. They can't grow anymore. So they're just going to kind of take it easier. You say, well, they shouldn't be so greedy, but you have to remember they're not just greedy. They're creating the way they're getting wealthier is by creating jobs. So they're creating economic opportunity that other people can take advantage of underneath them. So what they'll do is not grow as tall. The cost of this is that you lower innovation, you lower progress in terms of solving problems in your society. You kind of cap the standard of living, which people can think is pretty nice, but you shut down the growth potential. And it depends on what I guess you kind of want out of society. If you think that life is generally good enough and comfortable enough and accommodating enough now, and we can, have less, a lot of communists think that. Herbert Marcuse clearly says that in his book, One Dimensional Man, then I guess that's an okay solution. But if you think, look at how your life is in terms of material comforts and capabilities in 2026, compare it to what the average life was like in terms of material comforts and capabilities, diseases, and so on in 1926 or 1826. There's a meme I absolutely love. I have it saved on my phone. It shows a painting of an old-timey woman out washing clothes with a washboard in a stream. And it says something to the effect of Martha looking up and seeing so-and-so complain on social media about how much work the laundry is. And it just has like a little bubble off of her mouth. It's like, please, because you just go read I was watching this video on Instagram yesterday about just sewage 400 years ago and the disease that comes with that. 400 years ago. It's like mind-boggling to the modern eye and mind how you would survive, where you have to build the street in a particular way so that you can have stones to step on to cross the road so you don't have to walk through the sewage running down it like a river. Raw sewage running down the street with vehicles pulled by horses or whatever sloshing through that, splashing it. Like the disease is off the chart. You read the story about how George Washington died. He got strep throat. More than likely. It's not 100% certain which respiratory disease it was. One evening, out surveying his farm in the snow, his doctors didn't know what to do. They literally drained half of his blood, weakened him tremendously, fed him all kinds of weird potions, and he died like 48 hours later of something that we get antibiotics. By the way, penicillin was invented as a treatment in like 1928. So we just go back to 1926 and it's like, you got a bacterial infection because you got cut, you're probably going to die. Now it's like, oh yeah, just rub some ointment on it and like you have in your bathroom and you're good, right? It's like, seriously, you start thinking about that. And then you think about curtailing your level of innovation. So you know what? Life's good enough now. It's like you're Martha washing the board. Somebody's got to be like, please, where we're going to be in 100 years in terms of technological development is going to make people look back now and think about how gross and primitive things are in many respects in terms of solving basic problems. Like what? Well, we're on the cusp of solving desalinization. You talk about people having bad life. I guarantee you socialism is not going to solve desalinization. They're not going to figure out how to take salt out of the ocean and make potable water that people can drink or that you can use for other things. So as people's water needs remain high and go up, especially in desert regions, you're talking about fundamentally transforming the Middle East, North Africa, these regions completely. If Israel, which leads the world in that technology, figures out cheap, affordable, good desalinization programs. We're on the cusp of figuring that out now. This is a transformative technology that we won't even be able to contemplate what the world's like until we have it. And you're like, there shouldn't be billionaires, so let's slow down. Really? Really? There shouldn't be billionaires, so, like, maybe nobody will ever invent the MRI. Really? Like, that's your idea? There shouldn't be billionaires, so nobody should be rich enough to, figure out how to build a rocket that can go get rare earth minerals out of asteroids for far cheaper than we can dig them out of the ground, which is one of the major causes of war and environmental degradation and destruction on the planet. Really? Because you don't want Elon Musk to have $500 billion? Seems weird. Seems like the wrong mentality.
That's helpful. I'll be sure to type that in the comments and the next time somebody says something. Well, this has been such a great conversation. Obviously, I could just keep asking you questions, but I'm sure you have things to do. So I'm just curious, A, where can people find you? And off the top of your head, are there any resources that you would recommend if people want to go deeper in this topic?
Well, I mean, so you can find, I'm easy to find. My website is New Discourses, like you said at the start, newdiscourses.com. I mostly publish podcasts, but there are articles, there are videos, there are lots of things. I mean, just hundreds. I think there's almost 1,000 things published on New Discourses now. So there's a whole lot of resources on whatever subject. There's a search bar so you can kind of narrow it down to what you're interested in. So newdiscourses.com. It is on social media everywhere at New Discourses, including YouTube, which hosts the podcast on the YouTube platform, but also on all the other podcast platforms. It's at New Discourses. I go by on social media at Conceptual James, primarily X and Instagram are where I'm most active. So you can find me there. I now have a Facebook again. So they kicked me off for a long time and now I have one again. So you can go follow at Conceptual James there or wherever you like. And it's kind of a wild ride. I'm not going to kid you. I'm wild on social media, but that's where you can find me. Resources. I always tell people to start to develop. This is what, if anybody goes and listens to my podcast as a result of this, what they're going to discover is that the vast majority of my podcast episodes, not all of them, but the vast majority are me reading primary sources to people. Basically, several years ago, I realized I was telling people, read this, and people wouldn't read it. So I was like, oh, hell, I'll just read it to them. So I just started reading primary sources to people. So most of my podcasts are me reading primary sources to people. So when you say, what resources can I recommend for people to go deeper? I would recommend that people go read some of the primary sources. Like if you end up getting a copy of the Marxification of Education, I encourage you to read my book. That's fine. But I really encourage you to go read some of the source material, The Critical Turn in Education by Isaac Gottesman, Politics of Education by Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Read those things yourself. Read these papers by Gloria Ladson-Billings from the 90s, all from 95, actually, the three that I cite. It's worth seeing it for yourself. You're going to build a better foundation by reading the original sources. There are a lot of other people out there in the space. I recommend, being involved in the comment section, finding people that are commenting in ways that you resonate with, and then looking into finding out, talk to them, find out what else they're reading, what else they're watching, who else they're listening to, who else they're following. You can kind of use like the networking approach. But my sources that I recommend are almost always, almost exclusively primary sources. I might recommend in the education space, people look into the Teachers Freedom Alliance. I think they're very good. They're very helpful. I might recommend also, just to name an individual, if you are interested in this kind of like UNESCO, SEL kind of discussion, or if you're interested in the social reformers like John Dewey and the early 20th century guys, I recommend looking into the journalist Alex Newman. He's done an extensive amount of work on this. That's rather mind-boggling. So his handle on X is Alex Newman JOU, which is the first three letters of journalist, which I think is really kind of funny. But anyway, that's what it is. So you can go look into these guys too. There's other people out there. Network in the comments and find each other and share resources. I think that's the most valuable thing for people to do.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Audience, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, leave us your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye for now, everyone.